You can swear. I just don't. I feel like a Catholic school child who fears Zeus will fling him lightning down outside the church and that Jesus will blind me with his acid blood if I'm in the church, and I swear. So
not in front of the saints. Hello everyone, welcome to Radio Free Golgotha. This is another very special episode, and especially a special episode because we are joined by dear friend and colleague Josh Sharp. Hiya Josh, how you doing?
Doing all right, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. I am glad to be sitting down and talking about a whole host of things that we've got lined up to talk about. How are you doing, Jesse?
yes, I like long walks on the beach and small goatlings to bounce off of me at all moments because that's my life right now. Less the walks on the beach and more the goatlings. So yes, this is welcome to episode 20 the 7th of RFG. We are celebrating the wonderfully well-known Hellenic holy days. I'll start off there. I'll reverse because that's the well-known part. But in specifically following our calendar of the saints to pick an obscure feast that happens to fall during a time period we would love to address some, discuss some, and have some salon on some topics. Crowleyana? Is it Pollyanna? I don't. So I'm going to go back to the Catholic part, which I know, which is today is the feast of the Holy Martyrs of Ostia. There are many martyrs of Ostia, but these are the holy ones of April 10th. And we'll get to why that is a little bit right on course for us, but as far as hagiographic blur and major themes of imprisonment and the ocean and the dead and all these things going on. But this feast day of the Holy Martyrs of Ostia, April 10th, also coincides with the third day of the writing of the Book of the Law. And Joshua Adam Sharp, our guest, is being brought in as the world's foremost expert on all things Crowley, against his will.
Especially against that. Just put him on. Just painted a couple targets on him.
Against the wider Hellenic community's will.
yes, but in alignment with the great will. We bring you the great beast's left horn and right nipple. I don't know where I'm going with that. Anyway, as far as our topics of the day, the Holy Martyrs of Ostia, feast day. Beautiful, thank you. Our demon is none other than Aiwass or Aiwass, which will the ascribed holy guardian angel, Satan on the shoulder of Crowley himself. Our herb for the day, I'm British by association and sitting next to Al so many times. So herb is poppy, and there's a slight romantic nod towards a greater poppy culture, perhaps there. Topaz is the stone of the day. Our style of magic is channeling, which could be episodes long on discussing all those different things. The geomantic figure is Puer, right?
The boy, Good. The young warrior, the brash young thing.
The tarot trump, I'm doing these from memory, that's why I'm slow. The tarot trump is the magician, or also known as the Juggler. And our dead magician of the day is indeed Aleister Crowley. So we will, if you are new to us or we are new to you, some reciprocity of newness, we will bounce around between those topics and promise to talk about none of them or all of them or in part but not whole, and denying many other. Wow, I'm not on my game today. But okay. Hi, Josh. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, I'm so glad to be here. This is really exciting.
I'll put it out there that you're the first person other than Al that I've written a bio for. They're like, yeah, that looks great. And I was like, I think it was meant to be a joke, but cool. Yeah, sure.
I really try to, I have this whole weird thing where I'm really more comfortable with people defining me as they see me than me doing that for myself. So call me what you will.
Yeah, cover letters are the worst.
Yeah, it's terrible. I don't do them, really. That's why I don't really do anything normal in the regular world. So yeah, I have OTO affiliation. So I started initiating, I think, in around 2002. So I've been in now over 20 years. I got 20 years there. I'm an aspirant to AA, obviously not Alcoholics Anonymous, if you know me. And of course, cumbero. So work with the rest of you in this podcast quite often, and I'm very proud to do so. I mean, that's kind of my background. That I also play in a black metal band. Some of you might know me as Al Gall from Mehenet. So I think that covers it. Oh, and I own a Botanica here in New Orleans, along with a couple of my pals, Botanica Macumba.
All right. I was going to be like, you don't want to mention your business, but that's fine. I mean, hey.
Flying under the radar. Yeah. Would love to circle back.
Your business is not my business, apparently.
I would love to circle back and hear more about the awesome events that you've been doing at Botanica Macumba soon or at some point while we're sitting down and chatting. It's always exciting to come down and see you guys.
Kind of processing off of that, because the saints of the day are very Ocean of the Dead themed. The Holy Martyrs of Ostia, April 10th, it's a very bottom of the saints of the day list thing, and there's quite a few martyrs on this day. Many saints are martyrs. There's quite a few groupings of martyrs for this day, and there's many saints that are martyrs that are of Ostia or were killed at Ostia or were from Ostia. And in fact, the majority of the persecutions actually happen after the martyrs that we're talking about, that kind of start the whole ball rolling of the martyrdoms of Ostia. Ostia being the kind of coastal arm of Roman justice for some reason. They sent a lot of people to be imprisoned at Ostia, maybe for the sea air, because if you're persecuting nobles, there was actually in the research for this, there was a great website that had the prisoner code as part of evidence for what this was. But the idea that you had to, where is it? Meanwhile, the man who is not produced in court shall not be put in manacles made of iron that cleave to the bones, but in looser chains, so that there may be no torture, and yet the custody may remain secure. The incarcerated must not suffer darkness of an inner prison, but must be kept in good health by the enjoyment of light. And when night doubles the necessity for his guard, he shall be taken back to the vestibules of the prisons into healthful places. Granted, this code is a little bit after our martyrs, but this was... In fact, it is probably a response to the quality of the prisons that our martyrs were kept in. But the later martyrs of Ostia had a little bit nicer prescription of how they were kept. The martyrs of Ostia that we're talking about today have a very short storyline, which is that they were criminals that were in the prison. And this is legend, not necessarily fact, which is very true for many saints. This is mythic time here. But Pope St. Alexander I, who's the sixth pope, and I have to remember myself for that because Sixtus is the seventh pope. But Alexander I was imprisoned in Ostia, and he converted the criminals that were there in the cell with him, or in the prison with him. In the cell is what I think in my brain, that he's crammed into a little tiny thing. I don't know the reality of this. And the archaeology of Ostia actually has spent a great deal trying to find the prisons that saints were kept in. But these criminals were brought to the faith by Pope St. Alexander I. Then they were taken offshore in punishment on a boat. So they boarded a boat, and then the boat was scuttled around 115 CE AD. So they are a group of uncountable, or both singular and plural or something. There's more than one. The depictions, folklore has them anywhere from like 5 to up to 50. And there's part of this, I think, is the blur with other martyrs that happen on this day. You also have the martyrs of Georgia, which is like 6,000 monks that were martyred in Georgia in the 1600s by a Muslim army. And then the martyrs at Carthage, who are about 50 saints who were imprisoned in snakes and scorpions and then martyred because the snakes and scorpions didn't kill them. And it's a common theme with a lot of martyrdom, right? That you put somebody in something and they suffer.
Yeah, the first one doesn't take.
Yeah. And so we know the Carthage ones are 250, 100 and some odd years after our current martyrs of Ostia that we're exploring today. In research of this, I also had to go down the Alexander I rabbit hole, right? Because if that's the person that's bringing them to the faith and making them martyrs, okay, so I want to know more about that. And St. Alexander I, Pope St. Alexander I, is an interesting one because he's also, for all of the people out there this is both a rub and a nod, perhaps a rub nod, knob rub. No, that's something different. Holy water is said to have been introduced by St. Alexander I.
Yes.
The concept of holy water and the custom of mixing wine with water in the sacramental, but that's felt to be here. It's just ascribed to him. They have no idea if it's true. Holy water might be a little bit more timeline based.
The specifics of it I read were that he introduced the use of a holy water of sorts, which was A, with salt, and B, was specifically for the purification of Christian homes, of like chasing out evil influence of some kind. So it's more than just like who gets to make it and where it lives, like in the baptismal font or in little vials or what have you. And A, the addition of salt to it, and B, the idea that it's specifically meant to be used like both domestically and also in the battle against evil forces.
That's the part of it being with my rub is the extent that a lot of what is called Catholic folk magic gets termed Catholic witchcraft. And this isn't witchcraft yet, but people, quote unquote, stealing holy water. It's not quite, holy water's there for the, in addition to the fact that any Catholic can make holy water. That is thousands of year old tradition. But for the baptism of souls, actually any Catholic can baptize a soul in times of peril. You can, what is called pejoratively, bush baptize. But for on the record, then you take the child to a priest when you can, but it is considered that the child will get into heaven through the water that you created, through the baptism that you did because you were fearful of a baby's soul. So a lot of midwives were baptizing long ago. So that part is an interesting thing and is oftentimes a citation by Protestants against the exclusivity of Catholics. But they're still also exclusive. I mean, why not have your cake and eat it too? So holy water there as a sacramental or something used in the home as towards driving out things or putting in the foundation. It's one of the few things that you can do, especially by laity. So going and getting holy water and dousing things in holy water. And like the St. Benedict medal, for instance, this is one of the common exorcism sacramentals that can be used by burying them in the foundations, that if they are blessed by a priest or you dunk them in holy water as a second bet, that they themselves will drive out demons from the foundation or put them in the walls of the houses you're making them and things like that. I always like a little bit of possibility of demonic house possession. But that's just the other thing with Alexander is that it's dubious as to his death, as to whether or not it was Hadrian, Trajan, and was he decapitated? There's a lot of myth because he has his own hagiographic blur with a martyr named Alexander who's on that Nomentana, the road of many martyrs. And we also know that his jailer at a later place was Saint Quirinus, that his daughter's is also a saint, that he converted the jailer. So he's very good at converting people. Apparently, our martyrs were probably a trial run for Quirinus and Balbina, who's the daughter. And I think Quirinus is April 30th, and his daughter Balbina is, when is she? The 31st of March? Like she's just passed. The 30th or 31st of March. So there's this whole thing of proximity to the Pope and the early foundations of the church, especially in the 2nd century here, being like any proximity makes you a Christian and especially if you're killed for it. The early saints are always being put to death. This is what makes you a saint, right? Is martyrdom. The act of martyrdom is what makes you a saint, as started by Stephen and exemplified, of course, by Mr. Jesus.
Yeah, and then by the mid-3rd century, we've got a Saint Aurea of Ostia as well, the Golden Girl. And her myth also, or her hagiography also mirrors some of this. There's prisoners that are Christian and are made Christian. There's a prisoner named Censorinus who has his chains loosened miraculously after he's comforted by her. And then a bunch of soldiers convert to Christianity as a result of seeing this saintly miracle and who are later beheaded. And he's given us 17 soldiers. And they are actually in the Acta. There's a bit of spurious rigor where they're all named, which seems an advancement on the fact on the previous martyrs, which weren't, but were known as a group.
Yeah, and of course, her imprisonment also was that she got to live on her estate.
Yes, and crucially, of course, Aurea is depicted as being thrown into the sea with a millstone around her neck. So she's another drowned Ocean of the Dead saint.
Yeah, and the church there is said to be quite beautiful. But this and as the patron saint of Ostia, Saint Aurea. There are several saints, again, of martyrs of Ostia. So I mean, like beyond going into the idea of what martyrdom is, I think the thing that stands out to me about the Martyrs of Ostia, because of course this is a date-related thing and that's why it was originally picked, but I do love this idea of the scuttled boat being the means of execution, that it is we don't know the names of the specific first group of martyrs that were said to have been killed in 115. And because of this, it brings up conceptions of the Congolese conceptions of the Kulunga, which has been talked about tangentially and sometimes as a subject on the show before. And there are many interpretations of it. There are many versions of how to go through this. If you're an English reader, you're going to be looking at Foucault and at McGaffey for anthropological and both emic and etic views of what the Kulunga is. But as the friction layer created between the rubbing of the sphere of spirit and the sphere of matter, or sometimes created the world of matter itself, referred to as Kulunga, as the bride of Nzambi Mpungu, the creator's god, that the Kulunga is also intrinsically both connected to fire and water, and is viewed as any large body of water because of its liquid nature. So it is both a heat and a cooling at the same time, and that the ocean and large rivers are intrinsically connected to it. That if you're like in McGaffey, he's going to talk about crossing the river or having gone to the other side of the river as having crossed into the Kulunga, or in Foucault of referring to the larger Kulunga, the horizon line, the spread of water towards the horizon, and the sun's journey and the star's journey, light's journey itself from the east into the west, and the stars that we see that then are going in through the underworld, mirroring the journey of the human soul, and highlighting, interestingly, the 4 stations of the sun, right? The sunrise, noon, sunset, and midnight, which then you're going to see flashes of then, if you're a Thelemite or a Crowley fan, in Liber Resh, and kind of stations of the day of import as to how things go. But the Kulunga itself being tied to, was it Ochoa in Society of the Dead, that Chapter 2 goes into it pretty well, of it being a force of ambient dead, the process by which everything that has ever lived and everything that ever will live is tied to the fluidity of matter, and that the Kulunga itself, as a great ocean of the dead, is a concept that pervades Afro-diasporic faiths hugely. That this conception influences is there obviously in Palo, because it is a Congolese descended tradition, or the various Congolese Angola Bantu and the Kimbandas that are descended from them, and the Umbandas that are descended from them in Brazil. But then the proximity to this concept then influences other traditions, other Afro-diasporic traditions that are in contact with these Congolese groups. And because the Congolese were here enslaved first and brought over first en masse, especially the Mbundu Congolese, that this kind of sets the stage for later developments of spirituality to be built and scaffolded upon. So we see this conception of the Kulunga and the ocean of the dead, the ocean of both of the ambient dead, and then this is the ocean by which the more responsive dead swim through to come to us. But this is a foundational concept of exploring spirituality, I think, here in the Western Hemisphere, and it's specifically Congolese in origin. And I can't help but be drenched in the curiosity of it myself in looking at a group of like the martyrs at Ostia who are boarding a boat. So no one killed them by putting them on a boat, and no one killed them by sinking a ship. But somehow all those actions make this unnameable group of people, they're only named as a group, then become one with the ocean.
And then also provides a basis for later martyrs to be not filed away, but like to emerge from a deeper wake.
Other things, I was talking with Josh before we started, the other things I think with Ostia, in addition to Ostia, right? Ostia meaning host, right? Like thinking of the wafer of Christ being dipped into the wine at Mass. But the Ostia is a swear word in many Latinate languages, right? Because you're just referencing the host in an inappropriate manner. And I can't help but think of I think it's a Coil song, The Death of Pasolini, the Murder Me on the Bloodstained Coast of Ostia. They throw his bones over the White Cliff of Dover. Yeah. And other 90s classics that will sting in your head if you know. Josh, you had said you had found an interesting coincidence with that.
The only thing I was going to bring up, there's a couple of stuff. We were talking about the martyrs in the waters. Since we're talking a little bit later about Crowley's guardian angel, in one of those books, Liber 65, the third chapter is the sort of attributed to water. And there's a tale of a luscious devil of Italy. So again, we're in the same geographic area. Yeah, so the quote is basically, or I think earlier you were talking about the torture and all that. So there's this whole story of torture going on here, and that she hath been broken in pieces upon the wheel. The hands of the hangman have bound her unto it. The fountains of water have been loosed upon her. She hath struggled with exceeding torment. She hath burst in sunder with the weight of the waters. She hath sunk into the awful sea. And he says, so am I, O Adonai, my Lord, and such are the waters of thine intolerable essence. And so he's relating this martyrdom of this particular woman, this devil of Italy, who's martyred on the wheel in the waters, of course, to himself before God, being burst by God as by a martyr burst by the waters.
I think there's going to be some beautiful overlap with when someone's name is something like Oria and Aurea, and her name being Chrissy, right, in Greek. And this idea that I think it was the funeral stele that says like Chrissy lies here, the golden one lies here, and the kind of bringing that into an alchemical fold, that it would flag anybody that was reading this of like, whoa, what is this golden person that's buried where? And what is this? And what is the process by which we break matter to reorder it in the kind of alchemical perfection of things to make gold out of lead?
For sure. Yeah, I came across some crystalline mysteries with going over some notes of some discussions. I was looking up for Topaz, if we want to pivot over there briefly, around it as a fiery stone. So I was going through some notes and some conversations with Adley Nichols, who's, if you're not familiar with his work, has been doing some fantastic research comparing the Elucidarium Necromantium to earlier heptamerons and filling in an awful lot of blanks. Also been doing some great work on Sefer Ratzialis. So if we jump to talking Topaz, one of the things that I found was that there is a overlap of what gets called chrysolitis or chrysolite, topaz, and certain sapphires, especially the ones called golden sapphires. So most lapidaries class topaz as having green forms, which is usually what we call peridot now, and red forms, which is usually what we call topaz now. So chrysolite from the Greek obviously means golden, as we were saying, and topaz is indeed sometimes called golden sapphire. And it turns up as the 10th stone in the lapidary of the Sephiroth Aiwass. And it's actually described as chrysolitus of a golden color and sparkling as fire. I got interested in it because its power is said to gather together devils and the winds, and its virtue is to defend the place where it is from evil spirits and dead men, that they do not evil there. And the devils obey you, of course. And the figure is, you're meant to carve a vulture into it. So the oldest known source of this work, according to Joseph H. Peterson, is a 13th century manuscript, the Trinum Magicum, specifically the Veritum Sophorum Sigilla in there. And it gives, image of a vulture on chrysolite for curbing demons and calling them together, protecting a place and making demons obedient to the wearer. And I just was interested in how this topaz has so many qualities of being solary, for want of a better term, being clear, but also yellow, being fiery, and it's light that it absorbs and shines. And it's linked to the moon as well, interestingly, that it's said to follow the course of the moon. So when the moon is cloudy, the stone will be cloudy. When the moon is clear, the stone will be clear. As such, it's said to be good for treating lunatics and those who have been disordered by the moon's influence and things like that. And then just in general, as a stone for fire rather than a stone of fire, it's said to quench fires and excessive heat. One of the tests of antiquity is to put it in boiling water, and it will supposedly won't allow bubbling water to boil. It encourages all sorts of combats a lot of choleric tendencies. It encourages bodily chasteness. Dioscorides says it assuages wrath and sorrow. It's also said to reduce lust very frequently. So there's these qualities of it being for too much fire. And then there's also a bunch of stuff about light as well. It's said to take on the transparencies of other stones, or to give other stones transparencies. It's said that in one of the semi-mythic places that it's originally from, that it's inhabited by troglodytes. And it's said that the troglodyte language is from where we get the term topazin. And it's said that by a bunch of medieval lapidarists, at least. That means to look for. And there's all sorts of examples of it being a stone that you look into. So it doesn't explicitly, I haven't found any explicit sources for saying, oh, it's great for scrying, or for doing what we call evocatory scrying, or for calling spirits into. But there's all sorts of examples of it's said that in the mornings with the light of dawn, that kings should behold it, that it gives them good remembrance. If they look at it, its light will aid their memory and give them good manners. It's said that it should be set in gold, as another example of some gold mysteries. Isidore even says that the stone itself is a shining king and shines with all colors. It's said to comfort the men and beasts that look upon it as well. So these qualities of it being like an ennobling, fiery light as well that interests me.
I like that it has its own weird hagiographic blur with peridot, in that etymologically it is said, I'm not a member of this but by virtue of Liber Wikipedia, I am indeed, but that it gets its name from an island in the Red Sea, now called Zabargad, that was topazios in Greek, and that it was never a source of topaz, but was indeed a source of peridot. I also was thinking about what you said of the troglodytes, and the most common places for topaz as we know it, this particular gemstone, are going to be Brazil is by far the number one source now, but certain parts of Western Russia, Pakistan, India, Sri Lanka, Nigeria, and Southern Africa and Southeast Asia are heavy in the topaz areas. Also that it increases, when you're using it for healing, it is often felt to contain fire to the point where it will increase a fever and break a fever through this remedy. So it is one of those things, it is a stone that cures both fire, the wetness of a cold and the kind of hot wetness of a fever, that you can break through and bring balance back through the heat that is contained in topaz.
Yeah, it's doing antipathy and sympathy at the same time. Yeah, it's ennobling that which it rules and also combating that which it opposes. Yeah, totally. Said to be the second stone of Aaron's breastplate, and is again the wealth of biblical archaeology around what stones that the breastplate refers to in what order. The second one is also known as the Goldeny stone.
So there you have a divinatory component already, just because of the way that was used.
And certainly said to be used and linked to the Urim and Thurim. And there was
even a light. The story about the way the light would reflect off of the stone to give you an idea of which tribe was being spoken of. So there's kind of a real direct divinatory component and identity component to different stones.
Yeah, the breastplate's fascinating in those terms, and especially how people have sought to construct and reconstruct it. Yeah, that you've got an example of not just scrying in one stone, but potentially scrying in 12, which are also part of a table of things. But you can, along with which tribe you're talking about, you've got a 12-part taxonomy of everything, right?
Yep.
So yeah, you have another one of those. I'm trying to think of the term for like kinds of divination where you put the whole set out and see how they are interacting with each other or which ones draw you more. It feels a little like bone throwing in the sense of all your pieces are, or like a grand tableau where all of the cards are facing you and you're trying to work out what they're saying together.
You also have this sort of element where the lawman that you're wearing there, the breastplate, aside from having different tribes, you of course have the sort of celestial associations, and you're basically wearing something that is reflective of a sort of universal, or rather like a cosmological image.
The 12 parts of a 12-part cosmos are all represented. In theory, you can answer anything about that. It's a total ontological taxonomizing system.
And it's interesting because, to tie it into some of the other stuff, eventually getting to the great golden topaz that Crowley had set in his vermilion red cross.
No premeditation there at all, of course.
This, of course, was be worn as a lawman, but then also used as a divinatory tool. So
we're not
very much in the same way, because throughout that text, you get the relationship of the rose and the cross is cosmos and chaos and that interaction. So again,
so that's another good example, right? So the cross isn't just Crowley's showstone topaz isn't just a hunk of topaz. It's like a Rosicrucian cross. It's got the 49 other little
49 petals.
That's
right. Exactly. Red cross, 49 petals, topaz in the middle. Every one of those petals has a path or a letter, or so like you have a complete image of the universe, a Kabbalistic image of the universe there that you're then staring into, and then you have the glimmer off of the topaz.
Yeah,
so it's actually very similar to Aaron's breastplate.
Yeah, and also not dissimilar in terms, it puts me in mind, it's evocative of how certain of the angelic calls were received by Dee and Kelly in like the big download of 84, in that he's being shown tables and angels pointing at and signaling particular letters one at a time. So in this case, you've already got the letters on the thing. So it's also somewhere between kind of pop Ouija board version of a showstone as well, in that you've got the opportunity
absolutely.
to flash
Talking board in
particular
case there's any like copyright issues with that.
Sorry, talking board, yes. Spirit board, yeah.
Connecting it to the historical showstone that you guys are talking about, right? So the context of that, as I understand it, is this is the Crowley and Newberg going to build upon the D operations.
Yeah, though first there's actually two of those that happen in Mexico before he even knows Neuberg.
But that's the part that's funny to me, is for all of this, for all of the spelunking that can happen, I mean that in the gayest of metaphors, that will be ascribed to his relationship with Newberg. And I celebrate that happily. Go team spelunking. But that there's no premeditation whatsoever, but he's inspired to suddenly build upon something he did almost a decade earlier, and just happens to have this beautiful large topaz on the vermilion cross that brings things forward for him to do with Newberg. And
this is Algiers 1909, right? By the time they're like in the desert.
Yeah, and they basically walk, it's very far actually, because they're in like Bausada. They get there like November 30th. I think they go off all the way to like Biskra. I mean, they're going through like from Tunisia through through Algeria in just the middle of nowhere for periods of time. There even comes a moment where when he's preparing for these, he's reciting 1,001 times a day, at each one kneeling after each recitation of that portion of the Quran, and then continuing on. And he was told to do that more or less to prepare to receive the Aether. People sort of skip over in the story because, like you were bringing up, the spelunking. There's a moment, a really special moment where he's like, wow, sexuality can be a gift, an offering to the gods, not necessarily this sort of shameful thing. And it's demanded in this case. And that's a complex moment for him, even though it's not like he hasn't done it before a million times, but in the concept of religion, it becomes really important. But for the majority of it, that's not really what's going on. I know people like to homophobically giggle about it, but like in the reality, it was a pretty straightforward religious experience up until this moment where sodomy becomes demanded. as a part of it.
I don't mean to, and even in my own, like finding a metaphor around it, is because gets every conversation about their relationship and these workings gets clouded by it, by some weird unworked out homophobia or stigma or something that's going on. And I just remember forums I just had a birthday, so I can acknowledge how old I am, but the 90s, in the wee early internet days, before such larger places for categorization, but the discussion of these things and the publications that were around of, you're dealing with the wars between Typhonian and OTO and other things that are going on about mentioning the sin of homosexuality and what that is, and it being something that's discussed, of course, in these workings, and people kind of honing in on that and only that. And it again becomes the whole thing of like, what's the gay agenda? And there's some, I generally like the KO'd answer to it of like, more sodomy, more shit eating, more scat, like just figure out all your bad taboos and just indulge them and shut up already.
I mean, that's a huge part of his entire everything. And actually, I think it hasn't been, if you go to the confessions in the very early part of his life, before he even joins the Golden Dawn, he's studying Russian, he's in St. Petersburg, and he's working for the diplomatic service, or he's trying to get there. He's like working on his fourth language, and he becomes interested in the justification by sin. Now, he's there roughly around the time that Rasputin has his conversion. And I think that's really interesting because they're within a year of one another in that portion of St. Petersburg. But Rasputin would have already been going on about this from the monastery. And what I have no way of knowing, at least maybe somebody does, I don't know, how far that idea had gotten around, that sin was a necessary test or something that one had to go through in order to achieve salvation. But this was like vexing Crowley, as this idea that this was absolutely necessary, and not as an excuse. If you read his journals, he's basically trying to say that he had fallen into this sort of Manichaean vision of Christianity. Like philosophically, he had become convinced, regardless of what theologians have said, that there's no way around a Manichaean interpretation. And the real question comes down to, how are all of these things, sort of the question of the problem of evil, how does evil get resolved in the body of the one infinite God? And justification of sin through sin becomes one of the answers. And so this plays into the mystical component later, whereas I think a lot of people want to see it as an excuse for libertinism, but at least he's got a lot of pages of justification for it, if that's the case.
And in that, just as a side tangent, because what the fuck are we here for that? The justification for the kind of libertine atmosphere, I kind of end up feeling like half the time because Crowley's a hard one for me personally, because I mean, like I'm not affiliated with the same organizations you are, and it's more of a I'm going to dive in as I can and understand things as I can and move through things. But it feels like so much of any public movement where you're trying to where even if let's assume the noble cause, let's assume the noble effort here of trying to or believing in what's being taught and having to sell it to the masses, that sometimes it feels like the libertine thing is the false unicorn horn that might show you where the real unicorn horn is if they can pull you in that brief in the same way that's I don't know if I'm making sense here, but like the idea that like copious amounts of psychedelics will show you the same thing that hours of discipline and meditation will show you, but you don't necessarily have the same container, and therefore you will lose a lot of the things that you gain in psychedelic use that you could hold on to through meditation and building up the container for that, which is in line with a lot of other principles too, including like people that were very anti-Crowley, like Gurdjieff, right? And talking about building up and building up the body of light. And I think there's something that the forgetting that Crowley was at this, like even before the writing of the Book of the Law and even through this time period, which are so 5 years apart or just a few short years apart, how much he's doing every year in this time period is dizzying. And how much he's committing to, as you said, performing 1,001 recitals of like doing this to purify himself and bring vision to himself, by studying Hinduism from being Hindu, by studying Islam from being fully as Muslim as he can, to see through it. And which I understand there's also this kind of a right critique of the Orientalism and the colonization that goes through that. Of course, how is it, you're dipping into something and not necessarily bring anything back to it. But in his vision, whatever that is, there is something really fascinating about the man that dedicates himself this hard to the spiritual discipline and is trying to bring back anything that could be shared. Yeah. Now, that's of course assuming that it is 100% or 120% mathematical impossibility, but that it is a noble cause, that he believes everything he's saying. But there are many people that don't believe that at all.
No, I know there's a lot of people that don't, and I can understand why. Again, these self tales can always, more often than not, divert from the way that other people see them. But I think a counter to that is, look, you've got enough body of information, and you have enough people that were around at the time that, while even if they have a falling out, you can see that they were convinced of the sincerity in the moment. Now, was there a lot of hypocrisy? Of course, there was a lot of do as I say, not as I do behavior going on. But, I was really shocked, like even preparing to chat with y'all, I went back through, because I was really interested. Me and my buddy Jed have been arguing a lot about the sort of ontology of the reception of the law and Aiwass and the idea of entities and how do we square this with all this other spiritual interests that we clearly have. And so I revisited, one of the main things I did to prepare for this was to revisit what led up to the reception of the law. Not just to talk to y'all, but for myself, to be like, why is this such a fascinating moment? And why would I believe, why even look into Aiwass? Like, what's so interesting about that? I do think that there's a lot of stuff that doesn't get talked about it's dizzy, like you said, dizzying. It's hard to recount his time even before he joins the Golden Dawn, let alone once that portion of his magical journey begins. You just don't hear about it a lot. And so, I think it shows someone who's like really struggling with sexuality, Christianity, and those sorts of things, but has a deep-seated religious need. And then it gets pretty extreme when there's a reaction to it. It has a sort of an entheodromia where he turns to his opposite. And that's where you get some of the stranger stuff.
Yeah.
I don't even think him and Gurdjieff were that different in terms of disciplines and whatnot. They just, their personalities were bound to horns.
Yes, and I think there's an Eastern model of what an esoteric school should look like versus a Western post-Protestant, post-industrialization model looks like.
Mm-hmm.
And Gurdjieff's thought was there's never downtime. And so if you see people being indulgent and do it, then you are wasting time.
Yeah.
The reflection doesn't have to happen after, it happens during. And Gurdjieff was very strict on this, and by many people's accounts, extremely abusive in this way of smacking you back to reality. And you either like it or you don't. But there's different schools for different reasons. But Gurdjieff's main comment was that he was an evil man and that people should be buried. I think that is the exact quote, but I'll footnote it in the inevitable quote unquote footnotes that sometime happen. But that he just did not see proof of the work in Crowley himself is the critique. And there are many people that have that critique. It also brings up the whole point of, is the messenger the same as the message? Is it right in that case of by the time he's squandered away his money through various means or spent it on these incredible pursuits that allowed this material to come forth, depending on which polar you would like, which you would like to give, that, desperately trying to get students in the end of his life and being in this kind of drug days. Sure, you could question, where is the work then? But I still have the kind of very postmodern thing in my head of it separating. That's a larger conversation, right? Separating artists from the art. If I find the book and know nothing about the person, I get something out of the book, then I get something out of the book. And context, of course, words have context, language has context, and that complicates once you do know the context, but it doesn't change your experience of what these things are. And I specifically with Crowley, like he very much was inspired by the relationship, speaking to previous episodes, of Jibril to the prophet, peace be upon him, too, that the relationship between Aiwass and Crowley was something he spoke to an affinity of. He liked that idea of it being labeled as such, or that he felt it was. And certainly this great, as is often talked about, like whether it's Freemasonry or various different occult movements of being like, okay, let's dip Western Christianity and Judeo-Christianity back in Levantine spirituality and Islam and heretical Christianity and bring it back and see where this goes. And it kind of has this self-perpetuating engine that happens. And Gurdjieff himself is ultimately considered himself an esoteric Christian, even though where's the Christianity in Gurdjieffian philosophy, but he's espousing kind of a perennial philosophy that all things reflect this wholly affirming, wholly denying, holy resolution in that way. So anyway, before the Gurdjieff tangents get a little bit too much, and I am neither good at Crowley or Gurdjieff, just a fan of my goats. Anyway, that said, the Topaz itself, what is the revelations that happen with Topaz, just to kind of tie it back to that? Because I do think the Topaz and its inheritance of like fire scrying as being a word for fire itself in Sanskrit, or the light and the fiery stone that is of fire, but not for fire, or for fire, but not of fire, depending on which culture is looking at it. what specifically happens with the workings there? Can you summarize that?
Yeah, I mean, more or less, he's using the cross of the rose cross with the topaz in it and reciting the Enochian calls and whatnot while, they find a very distant place in the desert to do that. And this becomes like his sort of focal point for the vision. But he makes a note, all right, when he's talking about things like the body of light or visionary elements, which this is what he says. He says the topaz played a part not unlike that of a looking glass in the case of Alice, meaning Alice in Wonderland. And he said that he had learned not to trouble himself to travel to any particular place in his body of light because he realized that space was not a thing in itself, but merely a convenient category, one of many such, by reference to which we can distinguish objects from one another. He's no longer doing this rising on the plane sort of thing. He doesn't think he needs to go to some sphere. I think it's almost kind of like coordinate remote viewing, where you more or less, you have no idea what you're supposed to see. You just see what is there. And somehow the suggestion, in this case of the ritual of the call, brings to mind the vision. When you read the visions, it's very clear. This is like a DMT trip. He goes right through the machine elves and the whole world changes. So he's not describing sometimes within the vision, something will appear in the stone. Sometimes when he leaves the vision, there'll still be something in the stone, but the description seems to be a completely out-of-body experience in which he enters an entirely different realm. I would suspect this is because he's doing this in conjunction with meditations and whatnot. So when we talk about what do we mean by vision, and this comes to our discussion of channeling, I wanted to know his history of this because, if you'll permit me, when I went back to, what was he doing before the Golden Dawn? Because I think everyone assumes his methodology is straight out of the GD. And I really believe that's not true at all. He discusses developing clairaudience, clairvoyance, and clairsentience before he's in the GD. And I had to ask, where would he be doing this? So if you look at the history of what his influences were, while he's having his Manichaean freak out, and he decides that the devil is God and he's going to get a hold of the devil, and he's like, well, how do I do this? I need a technical manual. So he picks up Waite's Book of Black Magic and Pacts. And that's where he starts. He's really unimpressed with it. And in fact, he hates grimoire magic almost immediately in the way that it's petty, and he feels it's puerile, it's bad, it's just bad Christians being naughty and doesn't have noble pursuits. He really likes the description of the sacred magic of a Brahmin the mage. And so he begins going that route. He hits up A. Waite and says, can you give me some other books, author? And he gets A Cloud Upon the Sanctuary. So during this time, he's kind of going through grimoires, and he's practicing some of them still. In his journal, there's all kinds of interesting, more standard grimoire tradition evocations. So he's experienced with that. But there's other stuff going on around him at the time. He was a big fan of William James, who at the time, right around this era, was working for the Psychical Research Society, whose library was in Cambridge, which is, where Crowley was going to school. So he would have had access to those works. And then similarly, while he was actually in college, there was a chemist running the Psychical Research Society at the time. They were publishing all sorts of shit on what we would call psychism and, all kinds of paranormal, human excellence type stuff. So he would have been exposed to this spiritism, which, later he's going to say a lot of bad things about. But you have to wonder whether or not in that exposure, he's not, where else is he developing clairvoyance, clairaudience, and clairsentience from? Mm-hmm. So he's already getting these kinds of channeling techniques from somewhere other than just the Golden Dawn. So by the time he's skiing and he meets Julian Baker, the alchemist, and he's bragging in front of a bunch of people about his alchemy knowledge that he'd been reading, and he meets a real alchemist who's, maybe interested in him because he seems knowledgeable, but also maybe because he can tell the guy's a braggart and doesn't really know what he's talking about. And Crowley says this himself, actually. But he tells the guy he's trying to get a hold of the secret sanctuary of the saints that he read about in the Cloud Upon the Sanctuary. That's how Julian Baker puts him in touch with Jones and the Golden Dawn, and that portion of the story begins. But he's training in these other things. And so I think that's interesting just in terms of the different ways in which people do get visions. We can ask, are we just staring at a stone and are we expecting the spirit to appear in the stone before us like on our iPhone? Or are we expecting to have an out-of-body experience? Or are we expecting to have it come upon us? And I think in the history of, visionary or psychic experiences, there's a lot of different types.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really worthy thing to talk about beyond arguments about whether or not you poked the spirit and it was evoked to completion, to physical manifestation. I think there are plenty of examples. I mean, Jan Veenstra charts a shift across from at least 14th century Anglo-German usages of show stones as, in some cases, screens, but then also looking at the example of it being like an altarpiece, like a focal point about which a variety of angels are evoked that kind of hang around it rather than in it or out of it. This also absolutely makes me think of the operations of Gilbert and Davies recorded in the excellent book, The Art of Magic, where not only do they talk about sometimes seeing things in the stone, a thing shadowy in the stone, or even talk about the show stone actually like moving in some cases. They also record these rich visionary experiences that in some cases seem to be dreams, in some cases are them seeing themselves wandering around a landscape, in some cases are sent out into it and then come back with things. Yeah, no, I think this is absolutely worth talking about. There's a wealth of ways that not just scrying as seeing, but also channeling as receiving something from the vision seem to have been employed. Again, Crowley provides a fascinating set of points to jump off from about that. Yeah, I'm really glad you touched on that, Josh.
It is still quite interesting that the entirety of how magic works is still based on Al-Kindi, right? Like, and it's been interesting because there's been some recent exploration as to whether or not it was actually originating with Al-Kindi or not, but I don't really care because the theory is still the same as being talked about. And the idea of rays emanating from the stars going through the various spheres and the Homeric golden chain as it comes down, and how things bounce off of each other, then modifying that in various cultural permutations and contexts of the hot gaze, like Topaz, I thought, like, because Topaz is famous for averting the evil eye, but Topaz is an extreme heat. So anything that's hot will avert the evil eye, but things that are cool also avert the evil eye. And like it's different theories as to how things work, but the evil eye itself being a hot gaze, and this is one of the reasons that it's attributed to women more than men, is because the heat of menstrual blood comes out through the eye and pierces things in that way.
Certainly in the Italian forms and in the Southern European, where the gesture is to satisfy it in some way with the fica, right?
Yeah. But also in that sense that evil eye is a distinctly Mediterranean thing that has then gone out and framed and colonized all other forms of gaze.
Well, yes, no, precisely. That's what it ends up being called. But we've got very different concepts, slightly different concepts of overlooking across the kind of Anglo-Saxon sphere and similar things in other Northern European. And then by the time of the Renaissance, we get formalized into a conception of voiding or venting melancholy humor specifically. And that's where it starts to be overly cold and drying.
So much of the magical training, as I understand it, into the realms that we're talking about, is to never be completely passive and to never be fully active. That there has to be some cultivation of both things going on at any moment. And I'm definitely coming from this Gurdjieffian lens of like his thing of like you should always be working. But how do you let your guard down and enjoy too is a thing. You can make that choice to be like, I am going to receive more than I am going to be active right now. That sometimes that's good too, but you remaining that 1% or whatever mathematical formula of your activity is also what saves possession priests from killing people, right? That the deity is starting to do something horrible or the spirit is doing something horrible in their body, and they can then round themselves back because they're also being passive to the active of the spirit. And if it becomes at a tipping point where something is bad, then you become active and the spirit must become passive. That this shift is something that is in part of our training as magicians, sorcerers, witches, and otherwise. Maybe not witches because it's less training and more ecstatic union with the divine, but I'm biased. Kill everyone, rip off their heads, and just be drunk. But the conceptions there then of how one scries and what that means, that if you were too actively searching for something, then you will miss what you might need to be passive to. And then if you are too passive in your searching, then you will miss what you might need to be active to. And so there must be a right hand, left hand utility here by metaphor, not perhaps by literalism, who the fuck knows anymore, but that you have to have both. That you must have hard and soft focus, that there are whole manuals of looking into the crystal ball, right? And clouds moving from right are different from left to right, from up to down and down to up, and where things appear and which quadrant of it. And you can break that sphere into so many longitudes and latitudes and map things out very strongly. Or you might, for instance, project yourself into the middle of the crystal, and the topaz, for instance, in its hue, provides a prismatic light where your own body of light then shoots out your own rays to then prismatically call to everything that you're trying to have come, and it's interpreted through the medium of the stone. So you want to make sure that your show stone is of certain qualities in order to bring certain filtered messages to you, that the messages you might receive with an obsidian might in fact be different than clear crystal or the black screen of your iPhone or topaz. But those are all theories as to why something worked, but there's still this idea of shooting daggers, right? It's still this kind of Al-Kindi stellar rays thing permeating everything. But what I'm curious about is still this activity and this passivity that must be cultivated within Jechi. It's going to be considered like a double-headed arrow, which is building off of many people's philosophies there, partially Gurdjieffian, partially otherwise. But it cannot be totally, I seek the thing in the stone, because the stone might be seeking something in you by our ontology of magic. It is not, I say that breaking away from just the pure sorceress will of it, like that the human is the center point of the universe, but the human is the center point of the universe, as is every other thing. But that meeting and contestation of activity and passivity really interests me.
I think that's completely in keeping with the sort of visionary work that Crowley would have put forward, because I can tell just from my training in that there absolutely is a passive and an active element. When whether say you're taking a particular symbol, there may be certain active sort of visionary ways in which you anchor your relationship to the symbol. So some people like to memorize it visually and then pass through it or whatever. And then there comes the passive element of waiting for it to visually speak to some degree. But then you may need to stimulate it. There needs to be a sort of relationship. Like I can still, in a vision, turn my head, turn around, and follow through on what's happening, especially if I'm in a scene, like a landscape or something. And there is a level of which I can direct what's going on. But if I'm just directing, you run the risk of it becoming just like active imagination, rather than, I think, when you're allowing the passive side of the brain, or even if it is brain, who knows, passive side of mind to present, then you tend to get more unique. I don't know. I've had more, I guess, for lack of a better term, objective results from allowing the passive side to generate and then actively interacting with it when I need it to become more intelligible. And so there's a kind of a dance between those two things. This, I think you can see reflected in the way, and if you look at like Liber O or Liber E and the practices in there, you're going to be engaging both passive and active elements of the self in that working. If you look at what Crowley himself was training at for all of this and what he continued, and he's doing these concentration exercises with Eckenstein, his mountain climbing buddy in Mexico, who really wanted him to drop magic. And this comes out of a pretty fascinating tale that I don't know if many, but so at one point he goes to Ceylon with Alan Bennett, who's about to take the saffron robe. He's sort of leaving his Shavite background and becoming increasingly Buddhist in his outlook on the world. Crowley goes and trains with him for a long period of time. I should have written down what the exact amount was, but it was for quite some time. And they're working together on asana, pranayama, pratyahara, dhyana, dharana. These are the things that, and he attains a pretty significant amount of this, as is tested by Bennett and Bennett's own teachers. And I think he gets the dhyana on Bhavani. And he has this dhyana with Bhavani. It pretty much, he says, it's as if years of yoga and magic that he had been practicing were completely extinguished in this dhyana. Like it all blew into this one great moment that he had. And he entered a spiritual dry period for some time after that. So that when he gets to Mexico, almost on like a vacay, and Eckenstein arrives to go mountain climbing, Eckenstein tells him, quit magic. Just stop it with all this superstitious shit, which he doesn't really enjoy, Eckenstein anyway. And he says, learn to concentrate your mind. And he gives him these really mathematical puzzles, and they go on and on about the types of sort of internal mathematics that they do, mathematics games to focus the mind. And they're doing them in conjunction with sort of dangerous mountain climbing to really heighten mental acuity. But similar, if you're doing like asana and pranayama, I mean, your body is in a mix of active, passive, but you're sort of silent in that moment. You might call that passive. I mean, there's really a juxtaposition at all levels of those two states. Even in the asana, right? You're not perfectly slack. You're not super tense. You're somewhere in this sort of brace, but panther ready to pounce.
Oh,
energy.
for sure. The observation of activity and passivity is what makes activity and passivity be more than just you be passive, quite honestly, or because you can be passive to your own activity.
Yeah.
You can be high on control and you are not fully present. But all of the disciplines ultimately, right? I think you're right on point. Like, but that's what I'm saying. Our training in the magical world is trying to develop some understanding of this relationship to ourself, which changes in the fractions of a second.
In terms of his visions and vision of the voice, we definitely have him noting that he would be in trance, and that, sometimes between a sentence or two that he's reading out to the scribe, many minutes would pass before he would say another thing as he's sort of in the space. And I think anyone who's done these sorts of visionary exercises sometimes will note long periods of gathering your, what exactly is happening to you before you're ready to describe it. And it can be difficult for a record to be trying to speak out what for me, one of my biggest problems isn't not being able to see stuff. It's being able to, so much happens to me at once that I have trouble communicating it to any record. Even if I had sometimes I'll use a voice recorder for the vision. And I just, it's impossible. I can't get out every detail. I could tell you like the smallest parts of the rug, and I don't know. You have to discriminate, and this is an active component, between what is relevant, what is probably the quantum foam of the vision. Just you have to pass over. So,
well, the piece here that might fill in some of that or keep this discussion going in a way that links us back to our purported topics is the idea that he's scrying ethers, right? That there's a particular cosmology at work, maybe even
sure.
Some sense of and sometimes ethers are talked about in terms of like this infrastructure of the Empyrean, or of like levels of the astral. I think it's worth talking about that just a little bit, because this is the other piece, right? This is it not just happening in your head or in your soul or in your heart or in your controllable sphere of influence. There's we've already talked about like how the visions are being received and how the body needs to be an instrument for that, and the active and passive attentions, awarenesses, and attunements of the operator, of the seer, of the hearer. But I would be very curious about your thoughts around not just how Enochian is it, but also like what you think Crowley is claiming to do, whether he is ascending through these ethers or whether because his route is not direct, right? It's not linear always. There's a fair amount of back and forth. And I'd love to hear you talk more about that.
This is one of those controversies that I really wanted to talk about, because in modern thelema and, talk to a variety of people, it, depending on when you came up, there's more or less vogue sort of psychological model or, whatever, like this is a sort of inner space or whatever. Personally, my reading of Crowley rejects that entirely, in as much as if and only if what we mean by psychological is just random internalization, internal experiences. So early on, again, before he joins the Golden Dawn, and I was telling you he was working on a variety of ceremonial experiments. He's there with Gerald Kelly and this dude, Gerald Kelly, I can't remember his other, it's like Ivor Back or something like that. And he gives a story of them attempting magic. Okay, they're going to do an evocation. And at one point, they put their finger outside the circle and they pretty much give up on magic because they didn't die immediately when they did that. So they're like, this isn't objective. Who cares? And Crowley is like, maybe there's something up with you and you're just not any good at this. And maybe I am good at this. So I'm going to give it a shot. And he goes off to evoke these undines, and he goes to the beach because he wants to be close to the physical. He thinks it's important that if he's going to talk to undines, be near the ocean and the foam of the ocean. And he says he literally expects these undines to appear in the foam of the ocean. Like physically, this is the romantic in him, wants to see these entities. And he kind of tells this story where he's lighting a giant fire within the circle and he's doing all the prayers and, incantations. But the only undine that shows up is a police officer in a blue outfit. But then he kind of doesn't abandon this. It's like food for thought about your assumptions and he does this throughout all of his writing. The idea of the in and the out, like subject object. He's far beyond that ontologically. Like in his earliest writings, he attacks this as a primary philosophical conception that we need to not take for granted. So I think to him, this idea of, is this just an imagination, or is there real spirits? That's a naive and beginner, like a sort of amateur question of philosophy. And so even in the beginning of Magic and Theory and Practice, he basically wants you to read his essay Bereshith, which is an essay on ontology. And he's going to go through these like sort of the religious orientations of the world with regards to God, and whether or not God is, a gaseous vertebrate, like a personage. He kind of breaks it up into like monism. In Magic and Theory and Practice, he breaks it up into nihilism, monism, and dualism. And I think in the Bereshith, he has it as like, I'd have to look up Bereshith, whatever. He gives a similar reflection, three outlooks. And he's really interested in Vedantic thinking, the way that the Buddha handles, and responds to this. And he juxtaposes that to conceptions of the Christian deity, or sort of monotheism, and philosophies around that directly has bearing on the way that he starts to think about, could the policeman not have been the spirit? Like, I think this is in the Magical Record of the Beast 666. So it's like John Simmons and Grant's annotated version of some of his diaries. Yeah. And he asks, is Aiwass a separate being? And this, when it comes to the reality of Aiwass, and then later the Enochian visions, okay, because these are all very deeply related. He's asked, I think this is in the Magical Record of the Beast 666. So it's sort of like John Simmons and Grant's annotated version of some of his diaries. Yeah. And he asks, is Aiwass a separate being? At first, you get the materialists getting all excited when he says, I'm bound to answer no. But he goes on to say, I must explain that such no is the answer to the question of any name soever. No difference between you and him and a brick? He says, no, none. But then he kind of like affirms the differences between the personages of the Trinity, and says that it's easier to think so of Aiwass than a brick. And he brings up the fourth formless state, Turiya, where waking, dreaming, and sleep all merge as one conscious state. And he's trying to get at this point in there that from his mystical perspective, sure, there's no difference between the inner and the outer. There's no difference between your neighbor. Your neighbor is no more real than Aiwass is real, and Aiwass is no less real than your neighbor. They're all experiences that you're having, or divinity is having. That wall has to be broken down in order for him to answer to what he feels is truthful. But he does very much mean that these things are as objective and as real as any other thing that you might call that. It's just they're of different categories of being. And in Magic and Theory and Practice, he's at great pains, and he gives a lot of mathematical examples, like, say, for example, the square root of -1, or the root of whatever. And he's trying to say it's not so much that these don't represent something real in the world. It's just that the terminology that we're using and the denotation under certain conditions make no rational sense. Like the square root of -1 doesn't make a rational sense that you can give a object to necessarily, but without it, your understanding of the universe collapses. It's necessary for you mathematically to have that concept. So he starts to refer this to spirits and beings and other human beings in exactly the same way. And how you end up categorizing them is important, but he really wants to leave that to you to discover. He wants to leave the ultimate ontology of the universe as something that you're free to debate, rather than to create a faith system where he demands an ontology. Now, that doesn't mean that he doesn't put one forth, and he does, but I think that's important, that he's just, a lot of the times where he's willing to play around with the nature of these things, it's the philosopher in him. But he, without a doubt, repeatedly in the same text, in both the book I'm talking about here, The Record, as well as in Magic and Theory and Practice, talks about Aiwass as a disincarnate intelligence. And he goes to great pains, after talking about astral visions and all this other stuff, and the imagination, to say that there is a way you can figure out whether something has a kind of objective existence. And he gives a couple ways in which we try to look at what would we require of that. You require of a spirit to go, this isn't just me having a passionate and energized enthusiasm movement. And so he gives a couple of factors. And he believes that the Book of the Law satisfies those, and that Aiwass is a disincarnate entity, and one that shows up in these visions that we're talking about through the Calvary cross He shows up in the eighth aether and speaks. So
Yeah, shows up as a pyramid of light, right? And
yes, a pyramid of light. There's another way. It's so crazy because he shows up as a pyramid of light, but he's also there's some really important when he talks about a holy guardian angel. What do we mean by a guardian angel? Like the quote that people give, the materialists and the psychologists of Thelema that don't want you to believe in anything that they might consider supernaturalism or whatever, are always keen to point out some of his comments in the Equinox about how he chose the term holy guardian angel because it was so ridiculous that, even a child would know, like a fairy tale or something along those lines. But given all his other discussions on it, I think what he means by that is don't be reductive. When I say holy guardian angel, don't imagine to yourself that you immediately know exactly what I mean ontologically about what an angel might be. You have to take this further. Not that it's a stupid idea and it's actually just your Jungian true self or whatever whatever your it's not just the self in a sort of psychological sense. It's something much, much larger. And in fact, with Aiwass, who he says is his holy guardian angel, he describes it as a being, as was the genius of Plotinus, very God of very God. I think it's kind of interesting because in Orthodoxy, very God of very God is one way of saying as the Father is the true God, so is the Son. And it's a way of being able to describe how a partial, like an angel or a message or an experience, can nevertheless contain God the All. So the angel, the holy guardian angel, is sort of a messenger of God, but is itself Adonai, is itself God for you in this way, as just like how people talk about Jesus as sort of like the personal Lord. Is clearly a man, is a unit of the universe, and yet is God itself. That same mystery is present in the angel. So I don't think there's any easy answer to the nature of these things. You talk about the Enochian aethers. Are they the anima mundi of a place? Like when you look at Al, you'll know this better than I, but they're in the Enochian system, you have the seals that rule
parts
over
of the earth.
Yes.
Repeat that out,
Like,
it was hard to understand.
Yeah, sorry, go on. We're partly talking about the seals of the earth around the 91 parts of the earth.
So you have something like that where you might be tempted to look at that as like just an entity that authoritatively rules the political direction of a nation, but you might describe it as the spirit of the place itself too, right? The question comes, could you have a vision of the sigil of Algeria, the angel of Algeria, as if not only it has a directional power over Algeria, but it is itself a being that one could go in the way like a bacteria could enter your body? Because I feel like that's almost like how he's dealing with the angels of the airs. He's entering them, but they're still angels. So it's not just like something that appears in front of him and yaps at him. He's within it. And it's taking itself apart and using this phantasmagoria to unveil itself.
I mean, going back to even the concept of a showstone, right? That as far as angelos and what this means, that we're still talking about messenger, whether it's the body of the messenger itself or the message that it contains, which can be conflated, we've already discussed. But the idea that like angelos of being the showstone between you and the aether of whatever that is, it's still going to be. And if Al, you just touched on this in a couple episodes ago about this is one of the reasons that you should take everything that you receive in a vision as truth, as well as everything everybody else has received in a vision as truth. That there are many things that not just to look for like this underlying philosophy that joins all things. And one of the things that I think that is interesting, of course, focusing on ontology, because it really shifts magical thought if you're going to shift anything from epistemology to ontology, because ontology invites debate. Ontology has a sense of being, which is by its nature, and therefore being is different from being how can you describe it without defining it? Fuck me. Is different from calcification of thought into something transactable, and ultimately in our culture heavily transactable through commodity. That knowledge becomes something that is contained in lists and books and is a one-way reception, that that somehow the ancient wisdom flows through the text you read, and now you're the end all, you're the inheritor, you're the supreme end of evolution. But when you're engaging with that knowledge as a relationship, which ontology starts to provoke at, it's a very different thing.
Yeah.
Whether it's Topaz or any of these things, we are ultimately treating all of this materia, all of our experience as angels delivering a message, or at least you have the potential to engage with them in this way, which speaks to many things with Dion Fortune's, like, a true initiate can serve at any altar, or, whether it comes down to just get some fucking use out of your life. And if you don't like your certain circumstances and you can't change them, you can at least observe and figure out what the fuck you can learn from it. Because like otherwise it's really unbearable. And then you've already changed the activity and the passivity. You are no longer just passive to what is being active in your life. And this is not to victim blame. It's quite the opposite. That sometimes all you can do in tragedy when it's happening is at least actively witness it. Because just being overwhelmed by it, which is a perfectly valid response, especially as a trauma response, is something. But the more that you can actively witness it, you are now not allowing it to be completely active in your life, which can allow for the onion layer of proximity that's always talked about, whether it's, in sleep paralysis, they'll be like, tell your pinky to move. And if your pinky can move, then you might be able to move your ring finger and your pinky. You might be able to move your hand in that type of way, that there is something across the board, that the layers of perception here are related to the Doors and Jim Morrison. That was my TED talk and really bad expectations at the end. But yeah, so I think Topaz, or in this case, Poppy, is an interesting one because it complicates Crowley, especially with dealing with opium and heroin.
Sure.
And there are critiques, perhaps myself in my teens and 20s, but does Crowley's poetry really make sense if you've never had the milk of the poppy? I don't know. It is a certainly there was, I think that comes out of like the kind of chaotic ascriptions to certain magicians, and they're aligning them to their drugs of choice and seeing how the spirituality kind of parallels that.
Well, you're going to have a hard time with him because when it comes to
how many,
he's not William Burroughs.
Yes.
Burroughs is hitting the poppy all the time. Crowley is doing cocaine and mescaline and name a drug, ether. I mean, he's like all over the map with the drugs.
Absolutely. No, good call. It was the meth-induced description of your poppy high, of your heroin high, as to, so many words, so many beautiful words. Just because, I'm sure, and this is one of the great things about having you with us, is that we can cycle back in and out of Crowley the whole time and talking about this thing. Poppy as an herb is a Papaver somniferum. Specifically, there are many things called poppy. This plant is so interesting because of its seduction, right? Because of its connotation and use as medicine and as drug, which I don't know if there's a difference between those two, but one has a higher connotation of dosage and reparative work rather than recreational, or perhaps at least not reparative, if not outright destructive. But the mythology associated with the poppy, at least as far as Greek, which is a lovely coloring there, is that in the abduction of Persephone, being abducted by Hades, that Morpheus gave poppy to Demeter to ease her grief and suffering. And so poppy is a symbol of both the abduction of the goddess of flowers, as well as the mourning of the mother who does not have her, and that it eases grief. It therefore becomes associated in permutation in later expanses of people building upon this with the missing of family members, or specifically people who may be dead, but you're not sure. So fallen soldiers, or soldiers who are AWOL. And indeed, the poppy becomes the flower of fallen soldiers specifically, that it is also said to spring up from the blood of the soldier who thinks he's defending, that he's on the side of the right. It's not the assassin. It's not the terror. It's not people like trying to cause destruction. It is the blood that is spilled, thinking he is trying to do good, and that is rewarded with the bloom of the red poppy. And so there's something intrinsically, right? It like tinges the sentimentality of that just a little bit more than perhaps if it was just soldiers who die in battle become that. But like a soldier is usually thinking they're fighting on the side of something good, or that it shows the intrinsic relationship. Again, I think I listened to the audiobook of Karen Armstrong's book after I read it at least twice a year. It's good for everyone to read Fields of Blood or listen to it, or however your reading is experienced. But the intrinsic relationship of politics and religion is not what people think it is, but also that they are inextricably intertwined. That religion does exist to excuse the state of its shit. That's why religion was, or organized religion is created, and that there is no difference between those two. The political scheme and the religious scheme are always intertwined, and that part of the great experiment and considered fallacy by many is that you're going to try and take away, you're going to have separation of church and state, but all of your decisions of the state are still based upon a philosophy that is based upon a predominant religion. And so if you come at something that's completely different from your religious beliefs, then you're going to say, that doesn't make sense. Why do we have to talk in this way? Why do we have to air our grievances in this way? Like, those are still culturally bound. And that's why it gets confusing. But anyway, other digressions. So I think the poppy itself and its relationship to the Demeter, Persephone, Hades, like triangle of of things there as a gift of the god of dream, its relationship to the output of all of the known, the more romantic sides of opium and heroin, and eventually the opioids and the quote unquote hillbilly heroines of our modern day, and this intrinsic numbing that it does, its role in trauma, in subsiding the traumatic body, in not allowing to give or to allow the body possibly time to repair, both from pain or from emotional trauma, or both. But the medicine itself can then be something that is addicted, and you become poppy-eyed, right? Like you now give over to a world of numbness if the work is not done. And it speaks, I think, heavily to, I think it was Vanessa Sinclair. We were talking, and she was reminding a group of people about the original point of psychotropics as far as used in the soul of psychology, that the goal was never to put something on someone unless it's a chemical dependence, or lack of making it in the body that you're trying to replace. But the idea, and I'm hopefully not misquoting her here, but the idea that you're on something so that you can then allow yourself to do the actual therapeutic work of healing your own soul through whatever those means are. But that overdependence upon the thing that allows you to do that is kind of like saying, well, I have a cast on, so now I can go do whatever I want because my body is back to normal. It's not back to normal yet. The cast is there to support you for a certain amount of time so that your body can heal. And if it's a physical thing, then that's one thing. If it's an emotional thing, that's something completely different. So I think the poppy invites a whole exploration into what is healing itself. The doctor doesn't heal. The doctor, usually a surgeon, creates horrible traumas on the body. Then the body has to figure out how to heal, and the doctor has set the dominoes in order so that maybe you'll heal correctly. You'll heal towards a better balanced state. So ultimately, healing is always done by the patient. And this process of what that is, of giving over to grief and sadness and pulling the world with you into which, all of us are drama queens, and you're going to be pulling this kind of Demeter shift of my daughter is gone and I'm going to destroy the whole world in grief or in anger, depending on which version of the myth here is being told, which is part of the beauty of that mythic Angelos, right? Like you can retell it according to whatever lens you want, according to your agenda, that it is true and not true at the same time. But anyway, I love Poppy because of that. I think it invites us to understand our own depths of what we might be ignoring, or in the kind of perhaps just to spin it back there, because we're talking about Crowley, and I think there's something interesting about putting these two in the same episode for the fuck of it. Of you are given what you need to do your work. So your life circumstances, it's not about, you deserve this, but what you observe as your life circumstances is still filtered through your own lens, and therefore has a direct relationship with what you need to work on. And this relationship of, again, not to victim blame, because that's where we get to bad things happen for no reason sometimes, and good things happen to shitty people. So it is not, that's a whole other exploration. But that on the average day-to-day container, that we can look at our experiences through perhaps a poppy-like lens of what is it that I'm meant to be working on here. The grief, her grief was burying Demeter and all agriculture before that it wasn't even needed. She was killing everything, and she is a goddess that bestows life and in her grief. So her grief was already killing things. And that's a relationship there to examine. What can soften that so that we can then talk? What can we do to allow for a playing ground, or even in the kind of Eleusinian extension of it? If I was going to compare it to the Tradcraft parables and things of you need to clear a field before you plant in it. You need to know what it's made of. You need to know if the soil is going to bear fruit before you start planting the seeds of initiations, traditions, and otherwise. So one of the hardest things in engaging a candidate is you have to know them for a little bit of time, and they have to do some work clearing their field. Because if you're going to say this grows in this manner, in this way, just by this extremely extended metaphor now, maybe that tree does not grow in that type of soil on top of a rock. And we're going back to biblical parables here of mustard seed or stone, seed on the stone, seed on the sand type of thing, house built on those things. So there's some lovely, I guess this is where Poppy is making me go.
I was just going to say there's a lot of connection between all of the subjects here with regards to Poppy, clairvoyance, vision, and martyrdom, because I guess what it kind of makes me think of is the visions of the martyrs under torture and Poppy visions, and similarly runners high, we're talking about endogenous morphine, right? That is released upon either extreme pain or, like you said, the surgeon's trauma. Even before they inject you, your body is trying to maintain balance so that you can go on and not overwhelm you with the signals it's sending you of trauma. It's telling you you're being traumatized, but it also needs to be like, okay, I get it. Let's dial it back a little bit, and you get your endogenous morphines. But under that, you have visions. I mean, it's the dreams and the visions of morphine and heroin and whatnot are legendary. And so I think all of that ties those subjects directly together. And in some ways, that's probably what, the poppy sometimes gets, the lunar attribution because of its visionary capabilities, the ability for you to just suddenly float off into aether, as it were.
Yeah, in the language of the flowers, by the time we get to like Victorian floriography, poppies are typically said to symbolize eternal sleep, as well as oblivion and imagination. And there we've got the kind of two sides of the double-edged sword, right? Because we've got all the Hypnos stuff, right? Hypnos carrying a poppy stalk or a horn filled with poppy juice. We've got Morpheus, god of dreams, lending his name to morphine. But we've also got Thanatos, who's also said to, was often depicted wearing a crown of poppies as well. And so we have the soothing of the pain that allows for a vision out of that pain, and a vision of a life out of that thing, of the imagination to see a way out, but also the eternal sleep, the darkness of oblivion, of being removed from either the sensate body or the consequences of our actions or whatever it is. Like tis the dosage that makes it so, right? Between and medicine once again here. Yeah, it's interesting looking at some of the Old English folklore around the poppy and how it is, I wouldn't even say revered, kind of respected / feared. There's all sorts of ideas around overly staring into the center of poppies is said to cause blindness sometimes, or if they're put near the eyes, it's said to cause blindness. It's said if you handle them roughly, it can produce warts. And there's just this general sense of being careful with them. Sometimes it's said that if you harvest them, you mustn't let any of the petals fall off them for various reasons, as well as obviously the folklore still attests to using it for things like insomnia or other kinds of helping people rest after they've been put through an awful lot of pain. So there's this sense of absolutely like respecting it. It's a powerful thing. There's another Old English tradition that says that it's red because it springs from the blood of a dragon, often said to be slain by Saint Margaret, who seems to be the more popular dragon saint from Martha in England anyway.
Because Margaret slays the dragon and Martha is just like made it a pet.
The final thing here is that like there's a piece of I couldn't find any particular sources on it, but I found other people reporting that there's a Persian connotation of it representing love and those that have died for love's sake. So we have again this idea of like martyrdom as not just get me into heaven quick, but I love God more than I want to live.
Even the association with the fallen dead, which it has a larger folkloric context, and you're finding this great links to this Persian lore, you see heavily after World War I. So this is because of the poem by the McCrae, the Canadian doctor, I think. I have my notes.
Yeah, John McCrae, yeah, in Flanders Fields, yeah.
In Flanders Fields. So like in Flanders Fields, the poppies grow between the crosses row on row that mark our place, and in the sky, the larks still bravely singing by, scarce heard amidst the guns below. Or amid, I said amidst, which is pretentious, I'm told. But this is poetry. But the meaning in here about poppies is that the history of that, right? So he's in Belgium, and he saw the devastation firsthand, that within the first 10 minutes of battle, the Germans had just started using chlorine gas. And so there were 6,000 French casualties in the first 10 minutes of battle. After the first 17 days, half of McCrae's brigade had died in battle. And his close friend, one of his best friends, was killed in action. And he performed the burial service. And as he laid his friend to rest, he saw poppies everywhere. And that was because the poppies are not inhibited by the incredible environmental factors that were polluting everything else. So they did not care about the chlorine gas or the mortar fire or the debris of the battle. They were starting to bloom around the soldiers' graves. And this is just because of the place that they were, and poppies, of course, being prolific, and poppy seeds are their own thing. And, muffins and high school, driving test, drug test mythology and all those things. It's true. You can't eat a poppy seed muffin and go take a drug test. It's not good. But you can always take another one. And it brings in a little bit to what we've talked about. And I know I value cultural markers or cultural value-centered dates of commemoration of things. So like we perhaps don't put a lot on Veterans Day as much as we may have for those people that were involved in those wars. But I also find the situation of the number 11 Therefore, interesting, right? Because November 11th is Remembrance Day or Armistice Day or Veterans Day, but it's the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month in 1918 that is the end of the World War. So like that's already, you get an angel number there. Like that's some big shit. And yes, it's in addition to 99 and 1. So 19, therefore 10 being the year number, right? But 11, 11, 11, 10, and 19, 18. It's just, there's a lot there. And I think that there was a trend so much in the kind of neo-pagan revival to look through such a lens of nostalgia for especially through the Protestant West, through to the pre-Christian past, that it blinded a lot of people cultural looking into the traditions that were extant within culture still, or being added to through popular demand, through government decree, through public outcry of a demand for a holiday like Veterans Day, which is then because of a specific date, that to ignore that there are things on our calendar that move us forward, or that there are people celebrating things from a heretical perspective, not just the blasphemous, but from the heretical, is like that's a type of power you can still tap into. And that if people are commemorating the dead, and that, you know, poppies cry out to the fallen dead in this way, that this is how you get things like Robert Burns Day in Masonic lodges, right? There's gonna be a feast of the haggis, and it's going to be there because he was a Mason, and we're gonna you make this culture, which just seems in jest sometimes, and at the same time has a real significant thing if it keeps going. There's repetition creates something in all of that. And this is, I think, part of a larger thing that can be talked about in the future, because I was an interesting email to the show recently just about the nature, because I referenced things like traditional witchcraft. People always say, which tradition are you talking about? I was like, the traditional conceptions of witchcraft, not just this thing, but it does have a very specific agenda that was described in the 80s and 90s and permuted, and some people call it folkloric witchcraft now. And what that is, everybody has their generational term for what they use and why they use it. But again, I just want to give credit where credit is due, even with acknowledging something like Veterans Day. I really think that Corey Hutchinson did a great job on that, on his New World Witchery, and bringing that up early on, of like tapping into July 4th or Memorial Day or any of these American holidays that the average person doesn't necessarily feel like they have. The average neo-pagan witch specifically perhaps does not feel like they want to necessarily participate in the celebration of, because it's part of a larger popular culture. At the same time, there is a power there. There's a huge power.
And at the same time, we're all, well, I don't know. I certainly am guilty of like looking at a variety of you know, Roman festivals or something and being like, oh, that's excellent, that aligns with this obscure necromancy practice that I'm interested in. Yeah. While also needing to be aware that like that's also just a public holiday sometimes. Yeah. That it isn't necessarily wholly esoteric, and probably has more in common with people dragging around you know, asking for a penny for a guy, or any of these like, you know, folk means popular at a certain point, things people actually do, like the mass of people, not just interesting weirdos.
So bringing it back to topics, because I thank you, Poppy. Aiwass touched upon it, you know, the Holy Guardian Angel and this concept, but the specifics of Aiwass are fascinating. The
historical stuff. Yeah. Like
the idea that we can use this as our demon of the day without meaning any disrespect to the people. Like, it's the Holy Guardian Angel of Crowley. Like, he himself was he had his own special poetic words of how much this entity contained all opposites within itself for him.
One of the things that a lot of people don't have a copy of this because it's so expensive. I think the actual penciled, it's like of my buddy's book here that I'm borrowing just for this, like $125. We bought it like 20 years ago. It's just rarely rare. But in the Magical Record of the B666, the poetry on the demonic side, I have an entire lecture on Satan and Thelema, but I actually didn't reference this book very much. And if I had, I could expand that lecture by a whole other hour on his relationship to the devil. But it's real intense stuff. And it's interesting because in other places, you want to talk about the two opposites. All right, let's talk about the two opposites. Like in the one, okay, we have him describing here. This is from the eighth Aether. Okay. So in the Aether stuff, when we're talking about, you know, Aiwass, which is much later after the reception of the Book of the Law, because in the reception of the Book of the Law, you have him as the minister of Puer, the minister of silence, of the deity of silence. Horus as the little baby Hippocrates, giving you the shh, or maybe biting his thumb. In this, he describes himself not only as the minister of Hippocrates, the passive, you know, the babe in the egg, that sort of thing. He describes himself as the minister of Rahorkut or Raharakti, which is like a war god form, the more adult form of Horus. So he's the minister of both Horuses, baby, elder, passive, very active, fiery. And he says, but he is a viceroy of the unknown king. And you're like, who's this unknown king? And he describes it again. He says, I am the influence of the concealed one. And that's a reference to the Zohar. And then we get a lot of this other stuff about the wheel that has 8 and 70 parts. He's talking about Rhoda and all of these sorts of these things. But he says, all is equivalent to the gate that is the name of my Lord when it is spelt fully. And in his note, he says the gate equals Dalet. Spelt fully is 434. Well, there's only 2 major associations in Crowley's Sefer Sephiroth, or the 777 and other Kabbalistic writings. He gives 434 as the Lord of War, Aish Melchim, which is really funny because in everywhere else where we're talking about Aiwass as Satan, which we'll get to, here we have Aish Melchim, which is Yahweh. It's Yahweh as a man of war. It's from Exodus 15:3. And I think that's really fascinating because here we have ostensibly both God and association with God and his adversary or the adversary. And again, this comes back to that weird ontology and in all of Crowley's stuff, all the transabyssal things contain their opposites. So when we try to go like, well, who is Aiwass? It's like, well, he's the angel of the Lord. Mm-hmm. But which angel? And how that doesn't break anything at all. It starts to make, to me anyway, a complete sense. Why the Holy Guardian Angel might actually be your adversary, because he's your initiator. It's his job to play steel and steel, sharpening one another, that sort of thing. But to give it the demon, we talk about the demon of the day, because he says, come, Aiwass, come, thou devil, our Lord, on these snow glittering slopes of poison crystals, these soft crisp, deadly pure, exhilarating feather flakes, on these my soul shall stride. I think here, by the way, he's talking about cocaine. Somewhere in here, he's like doing a lot of cocaine and writing about his angel. I'm serious. He says, what mortal verse should please the ear that loves no less than a stabbed rival's moan, a soul's snarl as it swears her murder oath, or a child's scream of fear and pain, when she or I, at bidding of her, call Satan to pour brandy of crime into our lust's drained goblet, where once there foamed and sparkled love's champagne. I thought that one was real cute. But he goes on and on where he says, I, the cocaine fiend, laugh at him. I sing for our God, our devil, our Lord, Aiwass. He goes on of devilry, of dire desire, of dread delight. So he has a kind of aesthetic here going on in his journal with this. And over again, if you go through the magical record of the B666, Aiwass is ecstatically associated with the devil, our Lord. And he invokes Aiwass at one point, and he gets a vision of Baphomet and of the goat of Mendes. And it brings to him this sort of words from the oath of the Ipsissimus. And again, I mean, there's just so much devilry in just that one book alone. So when people try to equivocate on it, he gives you no equivocation in this piece. And you find it again in Magic and Theory and Practice. There's a note in the chapter of Black Magic and Pacts where he identifies Aiwass with the solar phallic hermetic Lucifer. And then he again attaches it to Satan. So this is just repeatedly, this angel is Satan. He even says at one point, he was called Aiwass, but now called Satan. And that's again in the magical records. But it's funny because simultaneously, when we're talking about these opposites, when he does his numerology in the Aethers, Aiwass initially adds for him to 78. And I think he has it. So he says that it's the influence from Keter and Mesla, right? That's 78, the influence from Keter. In other places, I didn't write down the exact lettering, but there's a special spelling. There's another name for another spelling of Aiwass that links the paths from Keter to Malkut. And so it becomes a form of the lightning bolt that you see in the Tree of Life, where you have the serpent, which is like all the paths. And then you have the lightning bolt, which is the Sephiroth connected all the way down. And then there's another path that he draws that's the path of Aiwass rather than the lightning bolt. It's his own connection. So he spans the whole Tree of Life. This isn't a minor spirit. This is like the messenger of God. And by making him, like I said earlier, the minister of the Ais Malachim, he's specifically a minister of God the Most High. So it definitely it's not an easy way to identify this as just some small spirit, or he doesn't want to conceive of it as just a lower entity. He's mentioned, so you can find the Aiwass mentioned in both the 8th and the 17th Aethers of the vision and the voice. He describes it as this guardian, the mighty angel that extendeth from the first to the last and maketh mysteries that are beyond. He defines, I think it's kind of interesting too, because he almost defines it as, there's a sense in which it's being defined as logos. So the word is deadlier than the lightning. And he says, the angel is made manifest upon the throne of the high priestess, the priestess of the silver star. Mm-hmm. Now, he's referring here to Gemel, the path of Gemel on the tree of life that connects Keter to Tifereth. And so you might find that in the Rider-Waite tarot, as the high priestess. And if you look in that book, in that tarot card, she's holding the Torah in her lap. So this would be like upon the throne. And of course, the Torah is the word, right? So there's another kind of sense of logos. But he does this permutation of Torah as Rhoda, the wheel, right? Which in the Aether it identifies it with as the 7 and the 8 and the 70. The wheel, and of course there's 78 cards of tarot. And so these mysteries are all a part of the nature of Aiwass. But in a way, by saying you're all the tarot cards, you're the wheel of fortune itself, you are the logos, the Torah, like you're part of all of these mysteries. It's like saying that Aiwass is the body of God, the tree of life itself. He's the minister of silence. In Crowley's system here, this silence we're talking about is like Ein Sof, Ein Sof 4. We're talking about the veils of the negative. So this is literally like an echo or a lightning bolt in the darkness come to, from the farthest beyond of divinity down into the earth. And you have the quote, it reminds me of the quote, of course, I saw Satan falling, like lightning from heaven. I actually think he directly relates those two things. He also notes Aiwass as the eye in the star of Hermes, the messenger whose formula is 418, being the full spelling of Cheth, the charioteer, and of course Abrahadabra. Mm-hmm. So initially that's his 78 stuff, where he kind of, that's his initial understanding of Aiwass as almost like a path from God to man. But later he gets a spelling. There's some really weird stuff that goes down with a man named Samuel Bar Aiwass, who contacts Crowley. So this story, and this comes into his play on like, how do you know an entity it exists outside of you? Mm-hmm. And he wants to give this idea. It's almost like early Karl Popper or something. Predictability, falsifiability. Can it make predictions? And does it have knowledge you couldn't possibly have known, but that comes true? Deep internal knowledge that even you yourself don't have, things along those lines. And he believes that Aiwass demonstrates these things. And one way that happens is he's doing like a sort of astral vision to speak with another magician. This is the Amalantra working. And don't quote me, but I think he's in Italy at the time. So I don't know, but
quoting yourself.
I think he's in Naples, but maybe I'm wrong. So he's speaking with this person and he's trying to get a spelling of Therion. And for whatever reason, it's very important to him to understand like the Kabbalah of the beast. And he gets this sort of like wacky thing that just it is not making sense to him. So he quits the vision. He gets a letter then that was postmarked at the exact time he was in the middle of the vision with this unknown magician. And in it, it's this man named Samuel Bar Aiwass, who basically is like, hey, dude, I've counted the number of the man. And he gives, it's 666 or whatever. And it's this enumeration of Therion in, I believe, Hebrew. And he also gives the Hebrew for Aiwass itself, which is Ayin Yud Vav Zayin, which is 93. And he's like, how did you, Mr. 93, not figure out that Aiwass can be spelled in Hebrew as 93? And so Crowley's like, what the hell? And that there's a man named Aiwass who's, I think it's like E.E. Cummings' secretary or something. Seriously. And he has Aiwass in his name. And he sent me this letter right when I was doing the ritual. So for him, this is really confirmatory that something weird is happening outside of just we're all having imaginary visions here. And, the guy Crowley comes up with a Greek form that confirms Aiwass as 418 as well. And so he's really excited that the importance of all of this cryptogram behavior is that it has the ability to show like encoded information of significance that he feels he couldn't possibly have known. But moreover, it correlates to certain physical events taking place in the world. So it's not just that like you can do funny things with math. It's that the funny things you're doing with math are correlating to events taking place that almost feel arranged. And this goes back to this idea of the angels everywhere. It's in common moments. It's in a man named Samuel Bar Aiwass, and yet it's the minister of Corpacrat.
That's such a strong engine for the investigation impulse, right? And you can see parallels of that, I think, in the Terry Wrist in the
Yes.
of like, who is this person? Is he real? Is this just a weird thing? And this heavily, like, this is Raw universe, Robert Anton Wilson universe, right? Of like, you can't tell what's the joke and what's not, which explores. And one of the things that I think the Discordians and a lot of the kind of 90s reaction to the kind of sweeping traditionalism that was starting to come in, that was exploring this. And I remember my early exposure to Thelema was like Duquette's classes at his condo, right? Like, that's like 90s shit. You're like, oh, we're going over to this magician's house. Like, oh, wow, cool. He writes books. But like, the problem is or perhaps where I'm going with this is that it can lead towards the paranoid. And I mean this in the classical sense, that you have to find ways to bring it back to the pronoic of like, you have to find both ways that you don't want it to be that the whole universe is working against you. That is not how it goes. And unfortunately, a lot of these systems, number systems especially, because they can be endlessly looked into, lead people towards the paranoid as opposed to the pronoic of like, things are working out in my favor. And then sometimes you get the infestation of the epitome of brocultism of like, I'm the gift for everybody and I have solved the code that is in the book of the law.
Yep.
Every woman is a Scarlet Woman. That is like a little too pronoic. Like, we have to find, maybe it's the active passive balance or the inner outer thing again of like, let's ground this a little bit in objectivity and a measurable metric. Yes, that's very
well. I don't always think Crowley was successful at doing that. I do think that, at least in his writing, that is stressed. It's one of the reasons why there's so much scathing humor about this behavior. You know, he compares it to the how is a raven like a writing desk? And he's very clear about the fact that through numerology here, you know, this gematria, you can pretty much arrive at whatever you want. It's why just getting Kabbalah crazy is not the point. Ultimately, it has to ground in. So you're trying to use it as a way to communicate with spirits in a sort of cipheric way that can breed some sort of, it's almost like he gives examples in Magic and Theory and Practice of like how it could be used to prove that it's not your own imagination and that the person you're communicating with couldn't have known. So it's being treated like a decodable cipher on both ends, like you might use in World War II, you know, but you're doing that also with entities. But simultaneously, you're expecting predictions from these things, and they better come true, because if they don't, it's worthless. So there does need to be a falsifiability. You can't falsify these internal Kabbalistic insight. But if something leads you to believe World War I is about to happen, you know, and it's going to happen in Turkey, it's going to, you know, or wherever, it's going to start off here. Those are things that can be confirmed or denied. Well, he came to believe that things like the Bartzabel working and others legitimately did that. And they did, as long as they did, if the publication dates are to be held up. Unless there was trickery with the publication dates, he basically predicts World War I. And, you know, he believes the Book of the Law in more coded form is talking about both great wars. But in terms of like, he gives all kinds of examples for personal reasons why he believes that. I think he does expect more than just cipheric behavior coming out of this in order for someone to get any validity out of it. And what he's not asserting is that there's like secret number power just inherent in it. There's a utility to this, and it can be used wrongly very easily, and often is. And he makes that clear in his introduction to 777.
Again, I feel like we're getting at this concept of like, vision isn't just about looking at things or being shown things or even having an internal experience. It's about arriving somewhere new or adding something of some kind of novelty, whether or not I want to frame that as outside of ourselves or something, you know, a priori, or priori that we have to like build the steps to. We're talking about interactions with spirits, encounters with states and forces, influences and awarenesses that speak of a two-way street, right? Of what are you getting out of this? What's the spirit delivering you? What is it carrying? What messages? And I think this leads impressively neatly, he said, patting himself on the back, to channeling, right? Because we're talking not just about the receiving of whole texts, although we are, obviously, our other feasts are of the reception of the Book of the Law, but of, you've already said, things that come to pass that are true, predictions, that prophecy. And prophecy is interesting here, I think, because it's not just the prediction of events, it's also the revelation of mysteries, right? And I think this is a key element in understanding the ways we can take Crowley's work. But it's also whether or not we're talking about the reception of our favorite or least favorite texts, right? Of concrete examples of things like the Book of the Law, or even the spanning of the diaries of Dee's angelical operations. But we're also talking about receiving secrets or instructions or recipes in a way that can be, again, something that isn't just the product of being declared a prophet of something and therefore receiving earth-shattering, aeon-turning revelations, but also just how we get things from our spirit work that's useful beyond just being for entertainment purposes only. And I think it also obviously leads to possession as well, because when we talk about channeling, we're often talking about someone in pop or in stereotypical depiction that's someone who isn't present themselves, but something else is speaking through them or moving through them.
Yeah.
I think even on that scale, right, it changes through timeline. And that's my lick the toad moment. But like channeling is often used specifically as a civilized form of possession.
100%.
And deliberately whitewashes the experience to this extent of like early descriptions or alternate descriptions of the Delphic oracle, just sitting calmly in a chair and sputtering, as opposed to like inhaling toxic fumes, being fed toxic things, and frothing at the mouth and having seizurous fits, whereby her twittering and like phatic language of like horrible things twisting her body was interpreted by priests and given in perfect meter, as opposed to like, you know, I summon the ancient ones from the ancient oceans to come to this table. Sure, that's cool. But there's always this impulse in that, like, when we get to, there's several names for it, but channeling within, let's say, traditional Wicca is going to have this sense that it's not me, it's the goddess, but it is still, the person's still there. The person is experiencing this as part of it, which deliberately, and channeling seems to imply that the person, for instance, you can channel a book and write it down as you're hearing it. But oftentimes there's this next level of channeling that gives over to a possession language where that starts to become much harder. The utilization of the body, of the physic of the body becomes harder the more intensely the connection is bonded. And so I think channeling becomes this interesting thing of what's the role of his woman in this thing, like who's speaking, who's not. What is the great, or for instance, when you go into treasure texts of Vajrayana and like the revelation that some people do actually see golden letters floating in the air when a terma is revealed. And if they have a scribe, they're reading out what they see. But the famous example given by Lama Sultram in Colorado of recounting this story that she had heard, so just making sure I do my due diligence, not my story to referencing her, but that terma was being revealed, and the Turton, the person who can reveal termas, says you missed something. And the scribe is like, no, I haven't. He goes, no, it's still in the air. Like the letters disappear as they're written down by this other person. And he's seeing the character floating in the air, as to other people who see scribbles as tertons, and suddenly it's in their head, memorized, and they can now say it. And like everybody has a different relationship, and certain texts are given in certain ways. The language of the Dakinis, they look at one symbol on a tapestry and suddenly they're given something in a full download, and they have to go write it down right now, or tell someone, write this down because it's only going to come now. And it's similar in some ways to what I've seen in my experience with possession-based traditions of a spirit coming down. They often will not give a recipe more than once. And is that to protect the mount, that it is just improvising in that kind of inundation of spirit-charged energy that's coming in? Or is it it's like, no, this is the limitations of the matter. This is what it is. Like, we don't repeat ourselves. Get it right, or don't talk to me about it. And the notion here too of the kind of evolution of and the study of the grimoire forms of evocation, invocation, and the battle between those terms, which is its own thing that I think we've talked about in the past, of learning to have a relationship with the spirit, even if it's by the complete traditional means, whereby that spirit, you are now channeling information from that spirit, whether or not it's fully informed in front of you in full materialization, or whether it is, just a voice off to your left shoulder, a la Crowley with Aiwass, and I find that description so beautiful of like, is it in Confessions, where just describing the voice of Aiwass is like, it's a beautiful tenor, possibly a baritone, that that the language itself, I can't detect the station of birth or anything like going on like that. And that they're dressed in, Assyrian or Persian garb that wasn't certainly not Arabic, I think is his weird parenthetical. But the idea of an incredibly incarnate being that he says was made of fine matter, as if it's smoke, which then brings to mind, well, you're in the land of the jinn, which is a whole other thing. which brings us back to talks with Jay last episode of like Iblis being in many permutations a jinn that was then elevated to the status of angel and what that means and how this happens. But
I have some stuff to say with channeling on this because we have two characters here in the channel. With regards to the reception of the Book of the Law, we talk about Aleister Crowley, but there's also Rose Edith Kelly. And again, a lot of the stuff before the Book of the Law is received is really telling. And like I was going to say that, I was wondering to myself, like, were these the kind of people that could do this? Or at least to my mind, so I'm being biased here, or like, was just someone fresh out of the Golden Dawn who wanted to be a prophet? And I really think it's the former. Rose Edith Kelly has a couple weird experiences before they receive the Book of the Law. So they go to Egypt the first time, and he does the preliminary invocation of the Guisha to show her the sylphs. Nothing, she doesn't see anything, at all. But she does get weird. And she, says they're waiting for you and all that. And then he's just very annoyed because it wasn't the point of the ritual. And then nothing happened. And they moved on to go to India. On their way back to Egypt for the second time, there's a moment that takes place. It's the bat incident. And I think it's really important when looking at Rose Edith Kelly as a potential, well, I guess we'll use the term mount, because of what happens. There's a moment in the room where there are bats all about this room. And if I recall this right, I think either she or Crowley kills one of them, and he describes it as if the spirit of the bat that died entered her, and she begins freaking out, climbing the pole and chirping like the bat, and is acting scared as if she's the just recently died bat that doesn't know what to do with itself. And so she's literally possessed of the spirit of the bat. And as you were saying, not in the controlled way of, oh, I'm there, I sense the bat's death, but no, she's become animal.
Yeah.
And this is the first time he notices that, is what is going on? And then they move on to Egypt. And so the second time he begins the sylph, the preliminary invocation of the Guisha, because the first time he did it, they're in the king's chamber, and he talks about the light that comes up. They stay the night, and there's like this sort of lilac light that appears in the king's chamber, and he eventually just snuffs out the candle and reads by this weird light to finish the spell. And again, she's just in a trance saying, they're waiting for you, but nothing comes of it. Now the bad experience, and they come back. The second time it happens, they're just, I don't know if they're in their hotel, they're somewhere, and then there's more data comes through, and it's ostensibly through her that this is happening. So she's the one channeling this thing, and by Crowley's description, it's very bodily. She's not really there. Even when she's saying it, she's not doing it like your neighborhood French Quarter tarot reader who thinks they know a lot about your life and they'll tell you what your ancestors need to tell you. That's not what's happening. She's gone. And when she's saying these things, so that when we get to the actual reception of the law, she's the one that tells him he's supposed to be in that room. All this information that it's from Horus, that's the stele of revealing, that's all Rose Edith Kelly. Mm-hmm. And he's hyper annoyed because he's the big bad magician and she doesn't know shit. And why is she telling him all this stuff? And he tests her, and he believes at some point, he's like, well, I'm going to go with this because there's some things happening here that I can't explain. And that's when, you get the reception of the law, and then his channeling begins. And it's almost like a transference. She gets hit first, and then it influences him. And then Aiwass appears over the left shoulder. But in his description, it's not just clairaudience that's taking place. He's at pains to describe the fact that it's driving his hand. Like he doesn't want to call it automatic writing, but it's like there's more going on. And even in the book, it's like the chant shape of the letters are important. As if like the prophecy isn't just what the content of the book, it's in the style of it. And that there will be things that he couldn't have known that his hand are doing. And so again, I think that's like, it's channeling in a near possessory sense. And he even says that when he finishes a chapter, he stands up immediately on the hour, which he was supposed to, as if it just happens.
I mean, it has so much in line with broader studies of this type of phenomenon, right? But like the idea of the current corriente, like that, if someone starts to see something and someone else is tuned in, like you'll see the experience mediums all click in and they'll just start finishing each other's sentences, and three or more people like, yeah, and this and this and this. So that idea of transference or that thing of something hitting somebody first who is the most, there's this lovely Brazilian term of puta astral, which is astral whore, of just like, you're the one that gets hit by everything first, whether it's the bahavento, like just the general oomph of the energy coming in the room, or it's an ere, or any cachizo or caboclo that comes through, you're the one that mounts everything, right? You're puta astral. But this notion then of like her being the most receptive, which fits into a lot of possession narratives. Certainly if Crowley was taking it up the bum in many cultures, then it would allow him to be more possessed more readily, because there's a popular belief in many cultures that have possession as more than just a negative experience, because it exists in most cultures as a negative only, in modern cultures, but where it can be something as other than negative, that it is specifically those who can be penetrated that have a different relationship to being possessed, which goes against the kind of heteronormativity of the Pope is talking to God, but how is he talking to God? What is the nature of this clairaudience that he has with God? And the tongue goes both ways, which reminded me of something randomly with the Ostia martyrs, of one of the later martyrs. The tongue was cut out and thrown to a falcon, but the falcon didn't eat it, and the arms or hands were cut off and thrown to dogs, but the dogs wouldn't eat it. This classical thing of like animals saying, I will not engage in my animal nature because this person is too holy. Anyway, with the Book of the Law, or like it reminds me of Mary of Egypt's lion helping bury her body, because that was his friend. Like the priest comes and the lion helps the man bury Mary of Egypt's body. But with the Book of the Law, it always fascinated me with like how much is just right time at the right place, because if we accept channeling as a possibility, as something other than a negative experience, it's not really, if we're talking about this way, I guess that there's no consent possibly really here, which is very true of many spirit initiations. But that you could be walking along and in the wrong place at the wrong time, and a spirit will fall into you and you now deliver the message. You also get the full example of what is that pivotal moment of Crowley's path of publishing something that then gets viewed as something that you shouldn't, and you have knowledge that you shouldn't have. And so we're going to elevate you past this, which could be a form of channeling, or a form that, let's say a spirit that's watching out for you makes you phrase things a certain way when you're talking, and someone sees that and goes, whoa, I just recognized something. That channeling also has to be detached from the messenger, and that it is not, you can be a prophet and not know how to do any of the damn things that you just said to do. And magic is one of those things that especially has this ability for, in the traditional descriptions of things, because it's used by historians, bad historians, not like Al, but that people who will apologize, that's the wrong term, dismiss magic as pure charlatanry, of evidence as to why it is that the people who are doing money drawing spells or money spells are themselves in destitution, or that if they are doing well, then it must be because they're scamming people. That there's this automatic bias against, just because you do not necessarily need to know how to perform the surgery to read from the textbook about how to perform the surgery. We're not talking about writing the surgery, but if we believe that channeling is a thing, writing the book, but if we're talking about channeling, you don't have to have a fucking clue what you're saying.
Totally. You can channel things that you ultimately are never going to put into practice, because they're not for you. You channeled it for the community, you channeled it for whoever.
Exactly.
Often the oracle isn't the person expected to put it into practice. It's like you get these people who are channeling, like, you need to do this on this moon. And like you were saying earlier, a recipe is given. Well, that recipe is never going to be given again. And it's only for that person it was told to, not the channeler.
And that, which also brings up the point of, even in the grimoire sense that we've talked about, all three of us at different conversations, of when we look at grimoire ascriptions or recipes or what these are, the point is in some way to get to a point where you are getting your own recipes from these spirits, because in truth, many of these things might just be at best practices or just notes from someone who actually wrote it down.
Yeah, we get that, especially from like, why would you conjure a spirit? Why would you go to all this length? So they can bring you the best book of magic and the understanding of it. That's the go-to example, which, as you say, might indicate that it's the most popular or first thing you do or most important thing, or simply that it's like the go-to text example of like, fill in or do whatever my will is, as it often puts as well. Yeah, no, exactly. These are all examples of getting something out of the interaction or the calling of the spirit or the discharging of it to go and do something.
And also, not to decry that like it's all bullshit to do a lot of the things experience wise in studying ritual, there are so many examples of theologians from many traditions talking about how a ritual is done without consideration of necessarily when the ritual will take for the person. There might be a performative utterance as to when the ritual is itself complete, but that does not mean that the ritual needs to be all 4 hours, or sometimes you perform it as all 4 hours because that's what's expected. And you really only needed to do 5 minutes here because this person is very different. And maybe that's the same way that like a wedding, some people really want the pomp and circumstance. Some people just are like, get me to the justice of the peace and do it. And both things are equally, binding forms of marital contract. The additional side of that is that thinking about, was just writing an article for the Veritas Genii, but looking at Jay's essay in the Champs of the criticism of, or one of the reasons why lunar mansions might be important, and this is specific to this, what he's writing about, is because advanced astrological elections are really fucking difficult to compute as someone who is not in the, or who is in the everyday realm of things. But to see where the moon is in the sky and demarcate it by stars as starting places of this is the bounds of this mansion is much easier to tell. And so therefore, what is going to be the more popular form of everyday magic might be the one that does not involve hours of setup calculations and possible errors. And although there are beautiful elections possible, those are things that you plan for. But there's no way you're going to be able to do election every day, because I want to take people's computers away from them and still see what they can do. And that's just me being a bitch. And I still have all those apps on my phone too, just because it is wonderful. What a splendid age we live in. But similarly here, in talking with spirits and talking with channeling, this is one of the great things of Spiritism, is that Spiritism in the United States is heavily where it evolves, right? And specifically in the area where I am at right now, the Hudson Valley was a kettle for it, crucible for it. But it was intrinsically evolved with abolition and feminism. And this was because you destroyed the authority of the church. You destroyed the need for man to only go. It's the ultimate in Protestantism, that you can talk directly to the spirits. You do not need a medium to do it, except that we are in reality. Some people are better mediums, so sometimes that's hard. It's kind of like, anybody can become anything they want, but sometimes we have predispositions that make it like a little bit easier to become such and such athlete or such and such surgeon or such and such whatever. So it's an interesting thing that we then see, some of these old truths might be based in some actual groundable theories. But anyway, the idea that Spiritism and the intrinsic relationship of the medium to be able to talk to spirits directly in this way, channeling and psychic exercises became such a thing, right? To train the brain to become that psychicism is an intrinsic hallmark of humanity, that we all have these abilities, and that you just have to figure out what your version of it is. And that's the important part of it, is that we all have intuition, which might not necessarily be anything more than just extremely systematic, fast thinking based upon experience and training, but still a lightning flash where we don't have to think about our decision or its position in the body. There's many ways to play with it. But that these training exercises go to like, how can you develop these gifts? Are you clairaudient? Yeah. Are you clairvoyant? Are you clairsmellant? I don't know what that word, clairolfactory, but yeah, clairolspice.
That what you're bringing up too is a sort of a pivotal part of Crowley's system, in the sense that when we were talking earlier about Kelly and Ivor Back's failure at magic to die by sticking their finger out of the circle, and Crowley responding that they may be their own capacity, I think that partially influenced him to this idea that capacity in informal magic is either a gift or something that needs to be developed. And so he started looking at the development. What are the qualities of a good magician? And for him, it turns out development of the individual genius is not only something that everyone can do, it might lead some people into formal magic, like we look at sorcery and things like that, and mysticism or whatever. But it may also just be the fact that individual genius can be applied to everyday living. And these same faculties that make a good magician make a person who's successful at knowing themselves, their way, and what they want to do. And so I think for him, a lot of what he ends up teaching is the development of that faculty first. And then we can get into the weeds of magic later if you have a capacity for it in and of itself. And that's where you see these huge diversions between him and, say, today's Grimoire revival or that sort of thing. He's not really trying to get people to start out with long lists of memorized prayers. That'll be good for some people. But more important to you now is that have your shit together and know yourself and apply that to your capability, know your capabilities and apply them as you see fit.
That's fantastic. Just in the, like, it's so ignored, right?
Yep. Yeah.
Someone comes to a magical teacher, and all three of us have had students. So someone can come to us and have no idea how they study, no idea what works for them as they study, and no idea of their own discipline that they can commit towards the study. And that makes the teacher's job so much harder.
Right.
Because then you have to take them through, if you care, you might then take them through an entire course of like, well, now we have to test shit out. This is like an allergy test. This is going to be tedious. And there's not going to be magic involved in this. This is things that you can learn about yourself before coming to any path, whether it's purely mundane or magical, or if there is even a difference between the two. And that's what you're touching on, is the blurring of this thing of, we're not just talking ritual magic in this way. It also speaks to something that is not talked about as much in the Western canon of magic, but what you hint at it in a beautiful way, of so much of magical systems that are engaged with, like, priesthood wise, let's say, there is a not universal, and so I won't propose that, but common theme that the magician themselves is in need of the medicine that they are seeking, and therefore more imbalanced than the person who can do their lives without magic.
100%.
And we're crazy ones that need magic in order to even function as normal human beings.
Yeah.
And like, that side of it, we are the medicine that we seek, whether it's a Sangoma priest or someone who's possessed by a jinn because they go into jinn magic because they have a natural propensity towards channeling, towards possession, or whether it's a voodoo sant who falls into trance, or someone who has extreme visions and nightmares from when they're little and can't sleep, and they have to figure out how to even sleep, and they have to figure out how to start over. You're supposed to be a healer, and you're like, okay, thanks, but I would just like to sleep. So it can bring up this kind of noble martyrdom that can happen. You can pretend you're an Ostia yourself, but it is also something that is not talked about and would be really good medicine for the kind of, and I don't mean this as merely something representative of ceremonial magic, but we do find it heavily in the kind of bro-cult platform, right? Of like how important that person is to figuring everything out. The worship of the will can also leave one terrifically unhumble not in the very Christian way of you should celebrate your successes. That's not what, I'm not Swedish, I'm Latino. So they're saying like, fuck that. But you also can say, maybe I don't need to broadcast to everybody, every single insight I have, because this was for me. What is for other people? What is for the community? What are those things? It's if you're getting possessed by yourself at your own shrine constantly and saying, oh, I lost 2 hours of my time. Did anybody record what happened? Because that's not necessarily a positive thing. Were your dishes done? Is your laundry folded? Like, what the fuck happened for 2 hours? Because life's short enough. We don't need to lose 2 hours just because you got drunk and called a spirit.
No, I think that's completely fair. At some point, it's not just, I think that's, and again, something that I think Crowley would warn against. It's not just about having crazy, phenomenal experiences that you get to go, wow. And he, at least for his part, was actually, throughout his confessions, highly annoyed when phenomena appeared that were not the resultant end of the ceremony, or were not in some way, elevating him towards a deeper understanding of the angel or God or whatever you want to call it.
I feel very akin to him in that.
There are knocks on the walls and someone just smashed a glass that I did. None of that was necessary. What does that have to do? He's pretty annoyed at that. And what's really funny, and again, this is my jab at the materialists and reductionists of his stuff. Going through the confessions, there are, and even in magic theory and practice, there are story after story of poltergeist-like phenomenon, demonic, like the demonic stuff from the Abramelin ritual. It's just all over supernaturalism. And the thing is, he really plays it like the man in the sense that it just doesn't matter. He's not denying it in any way. It's just completely freaking irrelevant to his goal, which is knowledge and conversation, the Holy Guardian Angel. And for him to find out where these secret sanctuary of saints that he read about all the way back in his youth, that guide mankind, he really is looking for this group of individuals that the Golden Dawn calls the secret chiefs, and that of which perhaps Aiwass is one, whatnot, that are elevating man to the next stage in their evolution spiritually, and so on and so forth. The Mahatmas and all that. No one needs, lights flickering and, apports and table tapping, like all of that just so distracting. But I think
you save the world here, people.
Yeah.
Is it the false unicorn horn again that like one of the reasons that we can always decry spiritualists is the sheer fraud that actually was documented of people cracking knuckles. But how many people can be told by their good friend the same advice that they will pay $150 to a psychic for, and ignore their friend and only give it advice when they have paid a lot of money and it's someone they deem as an authority for some reason?
Let me respond to that, because I want to play both sides here. I think there is, whether we get annoyed by phenomenon or not, they exist for a reason. And not just because they are the asides of the appearance of a power. There may be like an intellectual, how do I say this, like a spiritual reason. I think there are some people who just cannot really invest themselves until they know that this isn't a game. And that often comes through being injured deeply, hurt, or even scared out of their wits. And they either proceed with it or they don't. And they start taking things more seriously, and they de-internalize it. So it's not just mental masturbation. I also think on the other side of this, why might you not listen to your friend? To some degree, there's a good reason. Because if you're thinking about, I do this all the time. Why do I care about the Book of the Law? I wouldn't if I didn't think it was inspired by something more than just a good philosopher. Like that, don't get me wrong, I like to read all kinds of philosophers, but I wouldn't stick to a singular text so incredibly obsessively if I didn't think there was something more to it. A foresight that I can't get out of my neighbor. Now, I can get all kinds of great foresights out of my neighbor, but I don't necessarily get a prophetic time traveling foresight. That would be a kind of value that I wouldn't get out of that. So there's something to, I guess, preternatural authority that it's why I'm not reading James Joyce and living by it, aside from not understanding any of it. But, Ulysses is my holy book, because it's about as rational as the Book of the Law. At first glance, they're the same book.
Finnegan's Wake all the way.
So yeah, I think, but I mean, again, it's just, you go to the reader because your hopes are having like a transdimensional look at your situation, and not just, you don't go to the reader that's going to give you the self-help advice that you pulled from a Facebook meme.
I agree. The phenomena are there for a reason. I tend to, as you both know, I don't celebrate them. I don't like them. I think they're a waste of time after a certain point. I do think that they are useful in the ingress. I also think that if I'm going to play inner outer demon and bring it back to what are the internal phenomena, is also important to learn to dismiss, because that is where we get Da'at becoming God, right? That's where we become, oh my God, I'm getting possessed. That will destroy the possession, because you have now reified
every
ego.
time.
And
Yeah,
that
100%.
learning to not have that strong of a commentary is what will allow the submission to something other. And so that mapping of, and I think that's why because it's I can feel my godparents and the people that trained me being like, do not sink into those external things too big, because that's the same mirror process of what you will then go, oh my God, it's happening, when you feel it in you. You need to keep dancing, whether that's metaphoric or literal, of just keep the current flowing. And if it's not about you getting possessed, but of facilitating a message coming through, then you can figure out how to move that energy. If it's, let's say, a spiritist seance, Mesa Blanca or whatever, or whether it's a Kimbanda session, Umbanda session, whatever it is, if it's a drumming pro Orisha, the point is that you keep moving that current, and the current will do what it needs to do, even if that's quickly flashing through someone. And what would be called bajamento in Brazil, like that energy wave of the current can heal itself. It can make a person find their breath and their center again. And that's not even a conscious entity yet. There's these things that can happen. But if we rely on the phenomena too much, it will supplant. And specifically with possession, sometimes it happens spontaneously, sure, but a lot of times it's a very gradual thing. Just as exorcism, as we have talked about, is a very gradual process for most people. It's, refining and slowly purifying over time. But your ego clinging to it, saying, I am getting possessed. There's the I. Now it's little claws of your brain going, oh my God, it's happening. Have fucked you up further. Now you're not going to experience it. Now it's not going to happen.
That's in Raja Yoga too. Like when you're, it's exactly the same thing whether you're doing a mantra or you're beginning to have that dhyana on an object, and you realize you've lost yourself for a moment, and you go, wow, I was gone. And then it's just starting all over again. You just, that moment, that sharp break, as Crowley call them, breaks, just snapped you out of it, as that sort of self-consciousness.
Which is interesting, because I think one of the things that we're talking about in some ways, I'm pushing along, I'm going to get through those topics of juggling things. And obviously the magician card is such an easy pairing for Crowley because of this idea of having the two, as far as it is in the Rider-Waite and moving forward. And also that unique to the Thoth deck of the three different magicians?
Oh, there were 3 different drawings of that same card. You wouldn't use all 3 in the divination. You would.
No, that I know you wouldn't, but the fact that there was that many of the decks now even come with three magicians, all 3. And I find that use the one that you like. I love this type of variance, but this is another link of the magician to Crowley. But the magician card as the juggler, as the lowest card, because to have no value is not, 0 has no value. So it's a placeholder. So the Fool is not the lowest card, but the Magician is literally the lowest. And that's fascinating to me still. Like the whole journey of the Fool first starts with what? The Fool thinking he's the magician? The medicine we need in the world is still trying to figure out how to become the world.
For Crowley, it's a creation. There's a couple ways you can look at it. But for him, it's sort of this creation narrative to some degree. So you have the Fool as like preformed knot that is divinity. That's kind of a nothingness. And then you get the demiurge and the magician. The first person, it's like the first light that thinks it's the creator, but it actually isn't the top god, but sure as hell thinks that it's like Jal de Boath or something. And hence every story that the Magus weaves is a lie. It's an illusion. It's still the juggler. It's a magician, sure, but it's a magician that's weaving illusion. And what is he weaving? He's weaving Maya and that sort of thing. It's lowest because Maya's that's where you start, right?
Yeah.
So yeah. And I think in some of the other versions of the card you're talking about, there's a sort of, because if you look at who's in his cards, and the Ape of Thoth is in there, but it's also like Hanuman or something. And then you have this sort of, I don't know about the third one. One of them almost looks like Shiva or something, like, or some kind of, he's doing this kind of swastika dance.
Yeah, which is a whole like spelling out the Aleph, right?
Yes. Here, but though for the Magus, it would be Bet. In the Thoth Tarot, it's attributed to Bet the house.
Yeah, it's Levi in 56. It's in Transcendental Magic that he refers to the magician as Aleph, and that's a shift that Crowley makes. Yeah,
right. Because Aleph then ends up in Crowley's as the Fool, because he wants to identify it with the negative.
Yeah, and it's there's a shift too, right? That Aleph is a letter but not a letter, and the
beginning but not the beginning.
Yeah, or like. Even I remember in Biblit in high school, the sound that a camel makes before it spits deep in its throat, it's a glottal stop. But that was a very description that stank with me. Yes, that stayed with me. The Magician card and the Rider Waite, I like for own selfish reasons that it has the roses and the lilies, which as far as a traditional kind of Golden Dawn and influence thing is the cult of aspiration. The idea that you can aspire and fulfill potential through training, through proper training, that this is the beginning. The understanding how the universe works is this beginning. And it reminds me of the oft-quoted and oft misquoted by me, I expected the secrets of the universe and all I got was the Hebrew alphabet. The thing is that any extant system, in my opinion, and this is, I think in following the kind of true initiate, serve at any altar thing, that any system that is extant in the sense that it is truly able to withstand a few generations of proving itself can equally explain everything. That's the beauty of it, right? Like we can find those parallels with things, and that yes, there's philosophies that go through it. We can make things more complex or less complex, but the cosmology is where we start, right? That this elemental weapons of our magician from the 20th century forward, or the late, this is something there, right? That it moves from just the tools of conjure and distraction of the roadside magicians just stealing your money, and moves into the elemental weapons, especially just the paten and the dagger and the wand and the staff. And by the time it gets the Rider Waite of this infinity lemniscate that is floating with this number 1 above it, does have the arm patterns of as above, so below, referencing Hermetic maxims, and whether they're translated correctly or not, because that's a whole other hole I went down. There are so many translations of the Emerald Tablet previous to what it was when I was first researching in the 90s and early 2000s, but fucks with my brain a lot now. Anyway, just the white and the red there, as he's a freaking maypole, but the innocence there, but clothed in red, and the garland above that's there, as well as this really telltale sign of just basic. They couldn't use too many colors in the printing of the deck, but that bright yellow background is so telling of the magician, right? It's just what it is. It's a lot. It's a lot to look at. And it reminds me of the yellow wallpaper story, amongst other things, of like, it's the color that you go insane with the quickest, which is a myth, but now that it's incorporated into common parlance.
No, it's got a power of suggestion to it.
Yeah, exactly. That, it is a folk ascription, and therefore, for what it's worth, it is what it is. The magician in the Marseille deck has an extra finger in many cards, and because Hodorowski draws attention to that in his reimagining. I don't know if either of you have read Hodorowski's tarot book, but in his whole kind of let me find the original publisher and go back and redo a Marseille deck that is in league with Hodorowski's esoteric themes, but that it's a symbol of manipulating, reorganizing reality. And that the table he stands on has 3 legs rather than 4, stands in front of, and the 4th is outside the card, which from Hodorowski is going to be it's going beyond the possibilities of our inculcated elemental nature and moving into the reality of action and choice through the discipline of the magician. That it gives the potential, which again, echoing from the Rider-Waite, speaks to the cult of aspiration, fulfill the potential. Or as Professor Gwendolyn Alkers told me, pejoratively in college, and probably a theme throughout my life, of there comes a point where you have to stop rewarding potential. Ouch. Anyway, yeah, she got me though. She got me. Yeah, I think the Magician is a beautiful one and a pain in the ass card for those of us that do card readings, because if the person is a magician and the magician card comes up, they can't help but see themselves.
Yeah.
And that's always an interesting side of it, of like what is the magician as the cross? What is the meaning as the thing that bars you, that is obstructing your progress right now?
Yeah.
What is the magician as your foundation? What is the magician as your crown? What is the magician as your past? What is the magician as your future? Your eyes, the places that they see, and what are those things like? And when we're talking a spread of tarot, which is a much more recent kind of interpretation of cards in this way, but the idea of that, like the medicine you need, right? Like maybe the magician is like, we got to wear it to start, and then we're going to figure out how to move through it. This is where we start. And I think about those elemental tools. It's not untrue that a lot of people really like, whoa, Golden Dawn shit, that's the shit. And I'm not knocking Golden Dawn shit, but a lot of it can be really beautiful ritual, which gives rise to ceremonial magic revival in like a huge, more explosive way, sure. But it's like when Satanists or Luciferians only focus on the rebellion, not what happens after the fall, or anarchists only focus on tearing down things. And you're like, but what happens after? What systems are you going to put in place to help after? Jump out the plane, worry about the parachute later doesn't actually work, but it makes you a good martyr.
Yeah.
There's ever the root tension with the magician, is like you say, what might crown you, what might cross you. And that's where we end up landing after this history of kind of making the juggler and then the conjurer and the magician more occulted and full of more elemental symbolism and removed from his environment as well. I find that a really interesting shift from earlier depictions of the guy with his table at the market, then becomes then by the like 16th century, they're shown like actively running their show or their game. Like the cup and the ball is also an actual shell game, and there's other people there like entertaining children, or it seems people are in like a tavern or something. So then once we get to Marseille and those designs, like he starts to become an individuated figure again, and a paragon or an icon or a set of things to aspire to, right? A figure that has mastery over these elements of the movement of reality. And it was nice going through what the earlier ones were. And so there's something to this, right? That we end with. We start with this idea of the street entertainer, and we end with the idea of the one who bends reality to his focused will, or whatever, this ceremonial magician kind of tendency. And so we talk about a right side and the reverse side sometimes, right? We've got the notion of all the things that make you a successful traveling prestidigitator, right? Skillful, clever, alert, confidence, a charisma that you need to survive on your wits and to like talk or entertain people for a living, or fully creating your own destiny, whatever that is. And the flip side being, snake oilery, charlatanry, quackery, and the idea of like, are you bending? Are you changing minds that then help people change their lives, or are you distracting or simply juggling their attention? Where's the glamour prefiguring in this conception?
I feel like one of the important things, like in the Thoth Tarot, he doesn't do reversals. You wouldn't do that in this card, because for his conception, those are the same thing. Like they have to be. This Magus is the street juggler who is a fucking liar, and he's going to take your money. He's going to swindle you, but he's also secretly the demiurge. And there's like this kind of weird thing that happened with the Fool and the Magus, where they share something. Where you look at the Fool as like the court jester, the one who can tell the king, the only one who can tell the king through jokes how he's screwing up. And in a way, the Magus has that same sort of power as the person who's creating illusions and ripping you off, but they're managing infinity. And so there's still that paradox of high and low to them in this conception. I was almost wanting to point out that I think for me, the Magus here, there's a quote from 777 where he says, something to the effect, not an exact quote, but the magus is the thing that most certainly the neophyte is not. Like the neophyte kind of hates him because of this. He wants to be him, but he is not him. And it establishes this kind of Nietzschean slave master paradigm. The reality is, when both of these poles of the beginning magician and the magus, the great successful magician, is they have like an antagonistic relationship. And ultimately, one wants to transcend that desire to be the other in order to free themselves. They have to go beyond the master-slave relationship in a Nietzschean sense. So.
That's a really good link to, or at least I'm putting on that kind of, as we just entered the best sign of all, Aries, that the martial energy that's needed to, like the ram energy that's needed to start the seasons off, right, to kick the world out of winter, is also that kind of, having just seen my goats go through this today, of the youngers looking to the elders like, I'm going to challenge him, and one day I'm going to be the big goat, and then it's part of a cycle, right, which speaks in some ways to the geomantic figure, right? The fiery martial energy, although I should have checked if Al personally ascribes Puer to Mars again. I'm sorry. But that the sword, and I also know that you're fine with saying, oh yeah, a few people do. But that the martial energy that it is to look at something that you aspire to, and feel both the attraction and the destruction towards that thing, right? The antagonism and the attraction that is existent in everything that we are not currently, that can happen, especially with that impulse that is the magical desire that can happen so much for people around puberty, is where a lot of people really tap into their study of magic begins somewhere in puberty, as early teens to that kind of budding time when you're coming into your own and there's more agency and what is this, or that part of it is so fascinating to me. And Puer is definitely part of that, I would think.
Yeah, I think so. We talk a lot about Puer, and it's a martial figure, and it's said to be good for all things to do with war, to do with like conflict, to do with like competition, and that can include like team sports. It's fiercely wearing its gang colors and things like that. But it's also like common for Puer to, in spite of all of its like lairiness and its braggadocio and its like boys will be boys stuff, it's also said to be like good for love as well. It is a romantic figure in a way, and it's it's not necessarily everyone's idea of romance, but there's a
running up to someone and punching them in the arm. You mean it's not romance?
Classic Aries flirting there, yeah. But it's a version of it, right? It's definitely the love that hurls Molotovs from a burning barricade. Right, it's got hot activist vibes, as along with a number of other things, right? Falling in love is punk as fuck, etc. And so this idea of it being a search for this explosive externalizing, also being a potential search for a connection, is something that like is framed in its form of like why it has three singular or active or activating points in fire, air, and earth, and has a passive absent water, right? It is the night search. Grail and all those kinds of lovely Grail kind of things.
I was just thinking about that as you were talking of like, the thing with Puer is that it's not audacious. We're just slightly above it. Like those two little balls are hanging in the air, which also reminded me of the magician's hand holding the wand, interestingly, as another visual cue. But this idea of, extending it to their homoforms of the Odu and things like this, of by the time we go from what would be the equivalents of Irete or Merindilogun and drop to Ogunda, that we go from something that has the potential for a lot of destruction, but can also for a lot of discipline and treaties and pacts and making sure everything is assertive as opposed to aggressive. And then by the time those balls fall down and there's nothing left, there's nothing grounding it anymore, then that's where Ogunda is just like full force war, right? It's like you have to guide that machete or Ogun will destroy the world. Like the same force that creates it will destroy it. And that's like, there's just nothing to hold on to it. It's all the things that are movable by the time we go to Kata Draconis, of just, there's no hand anymore. It's just like all the elements that can move, water, air, and fire, are moving together, and there's nothing to stop it ever. And that's, I think about that just because you see that last chance of we're getting heavier. Like there's a chance for things being less grounded, but it's water that got dropped. And we still got a little bit of like earth to kind of keep, where a little bit like maybe it's the nature of the fire and the earth that spring forward. Or like I was thinking about this with the Kaliax Herbarium post about the Cuckoo Day, of the origin of April Fools, right? And that spring itself comes from the lands of fairy, like the summer lands that are there. The warm air is like the other lands starting to crack open again through winter.
and that it has to do with, like, I guess spring is not consensual. I was thinking about this a lot today. Like, it's a common meditation, right? Of like the animal kingdom of like, man, my three little goat boys are just, they're humping everything. I was like, you are a month and a half old. Leave your mother alone.
Oh God.
Yeah, and each other. I'm just like, please stop.
I go here now. This guy's here now.
Yeah, exactly.
Rehearsing. Yeah, again, Puer has very much that certain, I don't want to say innocence, because it's also the figure that connotes all sorts of robbery and mugging, violence, and unpleasantness. But there's a certain, like, kind of oafish purity to it almost a lot of the time. Like, it's a big barbarian baby, like, that's going to come in and be a big barbarian baby. It's not the full weight of fire's destruction loosed on the earth like Cowder, like you're saying. It's held. It's a source of fire that's like the lit match that might cause the explosion of or the damage of Cowder, or might be put to the flammable spreading fire of Acquisitio, or used to light the forge of Fortuna Major, but is itself cardinal. It's beginning, but also therefore fleeting.
Yeah, that's fleeting nature thing, right? Because if you have no water, the first thing you think of is a desert, right? It's that you can't see the oasis thing of what that is you can keep moving and you will find water. Right. You can survive through Puer.
Yeah. And Puer's like remediations can invert. What is its inversion? Albus, right? Can deal with that introversion, that bloodlessness, or that like stress on decorum and the world of like of ideas in your mind, and can caution or marshal some confidence, boldness, and courage to actually to walk through and find out.
And I think past the like, without describing, because again, you know how I want to talk about so much with Odu, but I don't want to, one, get in trouble, and two, speak and be like, there's so much context that has to be there. But in the order of the standard orders of Ifa, because there's 3 or 4 standard orders, and then there's probably a dozen past that with minor adjustments, right? Because there's only 16 figures. But almost universally, you're going to have a bunch of Odu in the beginning, starting with usually, so the equivalents of what would be Via, then Populus, and then some versions there where it's often and being the primary 4 figures that then explode out from there. And then there are other ones that mirror other Rommel traditions that might be more closely that came into Nigeria. And because we know that there's this evolution here that is outside of how Ifa explains itself now, but we can see the historical evolution coming into the first millennium and merging with other systems of divination and orality that were there, because there are praise poems in certain towns that cite the year and the king that was there when Ifa came into their town, meaning it wasn't always there. But that's a whole other story. And there's a lot of stuff on YouTube that's really highly controversial about that, of people yelling, you don't get to tell me this. Our town has always done it this way. I remember I knew your father, that type of stuff. But in the order, and why it's interesting, I guess, is that by the time you get to Ika, which is like 13 in the shells, or which would be Rubius, it matches all of a sudden, because Dilogun order is different from Ifa order. And all of a sudden you see 13, 14, 15, 16 equivalents in order. And Ika through Irete. And then the last 2 signs follow the mythology of is the youngest Odu, and then Ofun comes in Ifa because it was supplanted by a Geogbe, and is now container of phenomena itself, is now the last Odu, even though it is technically spiritually the eldest. And that is partially because of the youth energy, even though it's a different Odu, of Ejiogbe kind of supplanting. That's part of what Via, the equivalent, is doing. It's saying, oh, no, out with the old. This is part of the cycle of replacement. But what I was thinking about was that Irete, or Puer's equivalent, has its immediate follow is one of the ones we associate with water and flow of blood in the body and civilization, and as a remedy to Puer, or something that Puer brings. Because there's what's the logic of these orders? I'm finding and meditating on those things is why you can read effectively, because you're creating these things usually in the context of training and learning why these things are associated with this, because Ifa is so extensive, and this is where the key that turns the lock on this town is found in this Odu when it's oriented like this type of specificity. But the ideas here of Puer's heat leading to Oshe and the flow of civilization after all of the other Odu have spoken, because technically Ofun's influence is in through all of that already, right? That, I don't know, there's something interesting about that the heat gives rise to the highest shell number, 16 shells, or its Odu equivalent in Ifa of Irete, gives rise next in the order to Oshe. is something interesting.
And again, for all of Puer's externalizing of its feelings, of its like
Disproportionate emotionals,
yeah,
disproportionate reaction.
It itself doesn't usually. It reflects like arguments and anger and things like that, exactly. And then leading to, if we're talking about equivalents, like O'Shea's equivalent of Amicia, like the loss of the inhibitions, the spilling out of feelings, the overwhelming or the enfeebling feelings rather than the explosive expression of them. Yeah.
Oh my God, you just made me think something that I feel stupid about. Sorry for the exclamation. So amicio, right, is O'Shea, which is followed by Ofun, which is its opposite, meaning acquisitio. So everything spills and then is contained in creation. And I never thought about that before. That's hot, right? So all of the Odu get through everything, all of the heat is dispersed. Oshun effectively comes to save the world in O'Shea. And then it's like we have to contain that in something. So Big Daddy that knows everything, we're going to put you there and replace you with someone younger who likes to rule.
Scoop you up.
Oh, okay. So that was all heretical Ifa. I apologize. But at the same time, I'm going to use it. I'll use this in my acting just fine.
For Puer, connect over to tie it to the other stuff. It's Puer is one of the title, one of the Knox signs in AA. And it's, interestingly, it's as a sign, it's usually the dude with the right hand up and then the phallus erect with the left hand, and they usually attribute it to either Chem or Mentu. So you have like Mentu, especially the heat, right? The attribution of Mentu to heat from the sun, sort of like a manifestation of the heat, the scorching rays of the sun, and generally seen as a war god. So you sort of have that Puer Aries kind of association. And this is also like the sun of the grade for the Gevura, the 6=5 grade of AA. So you're looking at Mars again.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you're dealing with all the fieriness of Mars.
Yeah. And in this case, though, weirdly, also we brought up, we're talking about boy, right? Talking about a youthful energy. They give this to the letter in, so Moon and Scorpio. So you're getting the sort of the sexuality of it included, not just the beating them up and burning them down, and maybe even like holding some secrecy there. So scorpiotic qualities associated with these things. So fishy stuff.
Yeah, and I can't have to invoke that kind of Golden Dawn changing of the scorpion's venom to the ascent of the eagle, right? This is
right.
the tetramorphs and things coming in there, which speaks to the magician as the evolution of the self, the start of the evolution, not the end point, that the rebellion against the perceived error of the demiurge is not the thing that we hold the whole spirituality on, or that any point of the insipidus, right? The Molotov cocktail is not what you want to go to bed with.
So you got like scorpion, serpent, and eagle, or phoenix, for lack of a better term. Yeah. Scorpion being the kind of rebellion that, well, if I can't have it, I'll burn the whole damn place down in the ring of fire and sting myself to death, versus the serpent that keeps its venom as a tool and sheds its skin, is willing to change. And then you have the eagle who wets not a feather.
Which might be a great metaphor of pagan baptizing crown, not just speaking over people, but like in the kind of Quimbanda de Reis and Quimbanda tradicional schools of thought, of that this is directly parallel to pre-initiation, initiation, and even seeding the issue and moving for those things, but that's not guaranteed equivalent, that we have this relationship with every single spirit we come across, that there is a pagan relationship. And that is because in Portuguese, they use pagao as unruly. Pagan. In Spanish, you get the wonderful anti-Semitic Jewish as the equivalent of Judeo. But
isn't a bad Anglo equivalent in that specific context.
Yeah.
Right? Not in terms of the people of the heath or any like tied to northern tradition specifically, but like the sense of a pagan as
unruly, yeah. Which of course still brings me back to the divergence of Karen Armstrong, Fields of Blood, and talking about like civilization is specifically about the militaristic complex being developed to protect agricultural excess and stratified wealth across down to peasantry in order to make people rich. But that is literally what civilization means, is how can I oppress you to make grain for me so that I can live like a king, and thus drive civilization forward, which is a whole other thing. But within this context then of the metaphors then of a relationship with a spirit when we first meet it, like it's, who knows, it could be everything. It could be Satan, God, everything, the most powerful spirit you ever come across. You are drunk on the knowledge of what that spirit is. There's no bounds. They are living through you and you're living through them. And That type of relationship is really important to go through, but at a certain point, can be very destructive and unsafe. And so that's why there's stopgaps in training and traditions which are like, hey, let's see what this is. It is not necessarily the next thing is in this language would be to baptize, which is yes, about washing and creating a space in a relationship and things like that. In the strictest sense, it is referencing like church baptism. You went from completely unruly to like now you are entering civilization. You have the potential. You have a potential, which we might reward.
That's worth pointing out in terms of where exorcism tech is employed in conjuration as well, and the parts that are about making like baptizing the incense or what have you, or sprinkling holy water as a baptism of name as function. I name you this thing that's going to do this thing. It's also
which brings us back to our Martyrs of Ostia and Alexander the First also. But yeah, so baptism isn't unfair to call it a form of chaining, which people will say that like, you're saying but really what it is if we think about it this way, is if we think about our mind or our soul picture and our house as a similar thing, I'm going to have a very different reaction to someone that I just met for the first time and I'm out at a club partying or at a bar or at a conference and be like, oh my God, this person's amazing. I might not invite them to stay in my house right away. And if I do, they have to understand that I do things in my house a certain way. And that this is where the toilet paper is, and this is what you're expected to do. This is where the washing machine is. Please don't break down my walls. Don't set things on fire. Things that you would normally think that people know shouldn't necessarily be taken for granted with anybody. But it is a similar manner that if you're going to invite someone into your spiritual framework and form a more consistent relationship, that we might want to understand what those rules are, stated and unstated, which also has us being like, well, they should know that. Why should they know that? Especially something that is non-corporeal. And then moving towards, so this relationship often has a plateau feeling to it, of the person goes from all of the power that they feel with something to suddenly like, where'd it go? I don't even feel it anymore, because right now you're not in the club. This person's snoring in your guest room, and we're still figuring out what things are. Moving through that to a crowned phase, which is different from the terminology we would give it in Orisha, but that the spirit itself is now, again, independent of the operator or the macumbero or whoever it is, but that you are able to understand what is expected of each other and can act without having to check each other's moves constantly. That you don't have to say, no, spirit, you can't do that. I have to tell you exactly what to do. The spirit can act in concert with you, knowing what it is that you're trying to do, and that it is now, perhaps in some ways, there's no more chains, but there is a relationship of familiarity that's built up. And within many traditions, one of the things that I know that we had talked even with, remember it was one of the first times that we talked with Jake extensively in Cornwall, was we're talking about generational pacts and lineage pacts, of what it is when some operator that is your initiator made pacts with certain spirits or demons that they then pass to their spiritual offspring and move down. You now enter in with certain pacts to that lineage. You now have access to those pacts that were made long before you were even born. And that is similar to what many traditions are dealing with, whether it's Orisha and you're dealing with the fact that Orisha are said to have physical descendants upon this world, in the same way that not just the recognition that like Caesar had a certain charisma and therefore Venus is a natural ancestor for the Julii, but that maybe here in this way that Ogun founded this town and his descendants are here and they taught people how to call and how to work with that greater energy that is there.
In those cases, it's like a covenant with a people that might start out as a small people, but if it were to continue long enough, those pacts are just covenants. Which
is why it brings up the concept of like, you'll hear it in the Orisha community that like your Orisha work faster for your godchildren than they do for you, because to their godchildren, that's God. That's all Obatalas are in your godfathers or godmother's Obatala. And for the person who's Obatala that is, you're like, no, I know that Obatala. These are the signs it gave. Here's the name. Here's where it's a very different relationship. So it's like you always say, "Gotcha, like, hey, pray for my money too." When you talk to them, like pray for, because it's. But this is, you find parallels about this in the quote unquote idols of the ancient world too. That the temple priests are like struggling to get something done, but it's for that idol's performing miracles for people that come. And is this just faith? Is this just the chaos tool of like belief is being put into that, and therefore the person believes, and the people that are creating the sausage are like, well, is it the same for me? No, because I know what went into that idol. I don't know. There's lots of things to think about, but I do think about how this affects the greater thing of a temple. If I go to my godmother's Orisha and I'm talking to her and I'm praying for my godmother, whatever it is, but that her Orisha, her Yamaya, is now in charge of all of the God family, by extension, and is now, it's a generational pact that is the minute that I have entered into the fictive kinship is now honorary. This is my spiritual mother, that I now have a relationship with her spirits, not just my own. And that this interconnected, very tangled web is an interesting thing to navigate, and certainly echoes just as much as I heard the kind of psychological thelema, right, that goes on of like, oh no, the 72 of the Ars Paulina are aspects of your mind, and you can baptize them, tie them off, and they won't have any more effect on you. Doesn't mean that the demon's gone from the world, just from its influence on you, which was like a pretty big topic to do. And now people fight against that. They're like, does that mean you're never going to gamble again because you tied off Orobas? And that's, what is it? I don't know. Anyway, good call on the Scorpion and Snake and Phoenix, though. I never compared those to that phase of progression.
I would almost extend that to what you were saying a second ago about the God family and how does this work, even to objects. Because I was thinking about like maybe more like folk traditions, and a lot of people who come around shrines and they're like, there's a pack of Marlboros and like a Coca-Cola on here. How in the hell is that sacred? And it can be really like shocking to some people, and not just as an offering, but like imagining what I'm really referencing is like the sense that I think most people have that could be put off as nostalgia. So for example, like, why do you feel more magic-y with a kerosene lantern than an electric light bulb or whatever?
Yeah.
I used to pull that off as simply nostalgia or sort of exoticism applied to time. But I also think there may be like a real mediation of the dead there. And that comes with the Pax thing you're talking about.
Yeah.
So like, if you have a priest or priestess in a line, like a teacher or something, in a certain era, they have these really strong associations of things they've given to their spirits make those associations, they die, they then become the medium, they're going to have a nostalgia for the stuff that they did. And I would imagine that they would respond to that in a way, in the same way that you think about certain issues of Pomagiras and they have these antiquated images and desires of or clothing or whatever. It's like, they could, I suppose, update. If you lived in that time, that particular hat still has a kind of je ne sais quoi about it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And the spirit recognizes it. The priests of the time recognize it. And then now it takes on another dimension for you to harmonize with that,
But older doesn't necessarily mean better, but it does mean that it's potentially been more beta tested and you have access to more ghosts that have access to more expertise about that thing. At the very least.
Yeah. You're kind of bringing it back to ontology there, right? Of the necessity of not just the hands that touch it, the generational pact, but also the weight that we know, like when a spirit is used to being called in a certain way, that like it will put on, it just knows that it needs a hat. And like it's coming down, it's like, where's my hat? Oh, this is an interesting one. Thank you. And you put it on, they're like, huh. Or like, when Orisha comes down in a drumming and you have to get them up on Willow to put it to drape on them, and the Orisha's like, this color, why would you give me this? Like they have this, it's the preferences that come down, or we've joked about this before, but like how many puntos cantados in Umbanda Kimbanda, are like praise to insert spirit name here. When you come in the terreiro, you do good things. You do good things when you come in the terreiro. Like it's like, am I reminding you that you do good things, or am I telling you, by the way, when you come in this temple, you do good things? By creating the reality of which I'm allowing you into my house, and there you have, I guess, in the terms, the Ponto Cantado being a form of baptism of the spirit as it comes into this world. And remember how we do things here. Like remind your manners. It's an interesting side of things, and if somebody doesn't mind its manners, it needs to go quickly to the side.
Yeah,
and it past the Chestertonian. Is that the right adverb? Chesterton, right? A democracy of the dead. Al,
the tradition is the democracy of the dead, or some version of that quote that I will misquote every time and be surprised that it is not as eloquent when he says it as my memory of him saying it. Apologies, Mr. Chesterton. But yeah, there's the notion of romanticism and nostalgia that can go, which we have to understand our own tendencies towards Orientalism and primitivism, which can be wrapped up in huge amounts of our privilege and our internalized racism and classism and things like this, that when we interact with certain traditions, we want it to look a certain way, as opposed to what is the necessity of what is being done. Of the my confronting with my own, I had never seen a plastic deli container be used in a ritual way. And I need my gourd. And then I'm watching a documentary of Obatala priests, and they're using a plastic deli container to go to the river. I was like, it is perfect. I mean, it barely breaks when you drop it. It's going to last a lot longer than the gourd. It just jars with my thing of one of the advantages to extant traditions is that everything still has to be contained. But that on an airplane, that someone giving you instructions of where to go in case of an emergency should be contained in Odu. There should be a god that you can address for that if it is a functioning system and not just pastoral nostalgia. And I say that out of spite towards really good friends who I still see that their spirituality is more of an escape and more of a hearkening to a fantasy life, rather than how you confront your boss at work is part of your spirituality. How you deal with the person cutting you off in traffic is part of your spirituality. And it's funny because I thought about this with April 10th, and you brought up Puer with the war, and the third chapter of the Book of the Law is very different than the first two. And I am a god of war is coming in real strong here.
So one thing we haven't, as a jumping over part, back to since we were talking about the third chapter there, the peacock angel. It's another one of those places of insider versus outsider perspectives. It ties into what you were just saying a second ago, watching for either Orientalism or the desire for ancient nostalgia. Because, it's Crowley who makes this association that Aiwass is Melektaus, and that the old god once worshipped in Sumer. And that might be a part of, misunderstandings, or it might not be. But I think it's really interesting because of how this marginalized group of Kurds is pretty much demonized. I mean, some of the earliest texts are all calling them devil worshippers, but they would absolutely fucking hate that. They don't want to be called that. That's not what they're about. And so similarly with Aiwass, it's Crowley really wants to call it the devil. And yet, if you look, into some of his little associations here, it may as well be Yahweh. So what's going on? Again, insider, outsider. The peacock angel, we have this association. Where he got it is just such a mystery. This is something that happened to be in Sir Richard Francis Burton or something. I'm not sure. I haven't read this, but I know there is a essay by Tobias Churton that was done in the Aleister Crowleyan Western esotericism, where he talks about Crowley and the peacock angel and that the relationship to Aiwass in the Book of the Law. Some people really didn't like it. Some people did. I don't know. So I haven't read it yet. I don't know if it's any good, but I was trying to track down some sources for this, what texts he would have had access to. And if you look, the Black Book and the Book of Revelation from the Yazidi were available, translated, though there is enormous amounts of controversy surrounding those translations, whether they're real, how old they are, how much it was already had Western modification, or was there maybe some malefic intent into some of the translation. So one of the older books I have. So I think what I'm trying to say is I suspect Crowley was interested in that association, partially of this idea of ancient Sumerian devil worshippers, of which he would have been ooh. And then also the fact that it's a very solar, seven-fold kind of celestial attribution of angels and messengers, and that the rough time of it, the holy day where it touches the earth, is, depending on whether you're using the Gregorian or the Julian calendar, it's within a week or a couple of days of the reception of the Book of the Law. So he gets this idea of the peacock angel, the devil of Sumeria, and all that stuff. And I think it's partially a slander against the Yazidi. I have this book by Alphonse Mingana, who's a Syrian theologian. A lot of people also don't like this book, but this is a much older. This would be, I'm trying to remember if this was in the 1920s or 1930s when this was out. But he's quoting a lot of the books that are influencing the Yazidi backdrop. And I thought it was really interesting that one of the Gnostic saints, Mingana here sort of attributes an influence to the term Yazidi, or the people of Yazid, to Bardesanes, of all people, and saying that in this area of the sort of Syrian area, there was what they call Dysonists, or if I get this right, basically the people following I don't want to call it dishonest, but it's something along those lines. Anyhow, more or less meaning, followers of Bardesanes. And I think that's interesting because we find Bardesanes as one of the Gnostic saints in Crowley's, Gnostic Mass. Maybe another spot where he's attempting to smush these things together to maybe give Aiwass an existence outside of his own experience, like a way of saying that the thing has been around, or wanting to claim that in some way.
Doesn't he in that list also, is that the same description where it talks about like he is also a man in so much that he is wearing human flesh to be the medium of something past the human flesh? It's interesting because there's so many contradictions in what he's talking about, the same thing, and it's meant, I feel, to kind of thunder perfect mind you out of it by doing this broad sweeps of the same things Crowley's often accused of. Let's do the most extreme things, and somehow Aiwass is the great beast, but also the ancient god of Sumer, who's also this Meliktaos, who's often these other things, and is Meliktaos kind of. I would be curious here, like, is this kind of like the inclusion by the time you get to someone like LeVay, who just starts incorporating the names of anything that he could incorporate into the lists of like names of the devil, including Damballa. And you're like, Damballa is like the very opposite of what we would consider like a shaitan. But it's just one of those things, it's otherness that gets invoked itself through this list of names.
That's initially what I would have thought, is that because of the slanderous association of shaitan with Meliktaos, that Crowley would have jumped on that, right? But
well,
also
there wasn't that much written too, right?
No, not at all.
And certainly like between the Black Book and the Book of Revelation, both are contested, as you said. And then you have the thought that the Asciti only create these books so that they can stop being persecuted, because there is a prohibition against persecuting people of the book. So it's not a religion unless there is a written text in Islam. And specifically specifically that Quranic verse is felt to be interpreting of don't persecute Jews and Christians. But in addition, don't persecute Muslims, but that gets extended. Like, what does that mean when we encounter other traditions? And
Sabians too.
Yeah. By the time we get to Yazidi, and like, I remember like, Idris Shah quoting, and that's the 60s by the time we get there, of just like saying that there is a cult of peacock angel worshiping people in London that is there. And you're like, it's to what extent? Like, the Yazidis don't accept converts. And this becomes a thing of like, who's appropriating this now? To also the inclusion of Meliktaos in neo-paganism, and specifically the Anderson fairy tradition of witchcraft, which is this just an otherness that's invoked? Is this a foreign god form that comes in, or that wears this illusory body of the blue god of the peacock angel for Victor Anderson, who's, this by the time you get to the 70s and 80s, anybody who is inspired by Gardner's vision, and maybe Cochrane's vision, although that was not as much known at that time, except to small circles in the UK, but that would try and prove that they were anything but Wicca and add into the universalism of this growing religion that was developing legitimately. It was the open sourcing of anything. I'm curious how much of it really, not that there might not be a connection, because there can always be a connection, but I think there is legitimacy in crying to or appealing to the literary device of listing otherness and listing not salacious but scandalous names of things that are foreign. I
feel like some of that's there, and I think that's an element. That's probably what sparked the interest, right? The investigation was, oh wait, what? But then when you look at the creation story, okay, there's a couple of things that show up, and I've seen this in other places I can't fully talk about, but there's the specific story of not bowing to Adam, because Meliktaos is commanded by God not to bow when the other angels bow, and that this is interpreted as a positive thing among the Yazidi, right? This is like showing that he submitted to the commandment of God and is in no way a fallen angel, is one of the creatrixes of the people and, of the world, and is a very, very positive, life-giving, solar rainbow, power of the flourishing of the earth, almost like Al-Qadir or something. Like, this is good stuff. But the same story happens with Iblis, and it's a bad thing. And so the neighbors around the Yazidi, of course, are like, you're actually worshiping Iblis. And they're like, well, I promise you we're not. That story would have been available to Crowley, and that conflict would have been well known to him, even in his time. There was plenty of that information.
Certainly, it wasn't only the Yazidis that had that belief that Iblis was something, that there were many Sufi heretical sects that in the same way that, changing the Shahada to be like, I am God, is already heretical by normal standards. But of course, when you're looking at from the Sufic maxims, then like, yeah, don't destroy the unity by separating yourself from God. It's the same thing with Iblis, like, right? We had a great talk with Jay. Well, I can't talk at all. So yeah, I know. I mean, it's just that it's that conflation of that story and all the permutations of it. That's certainly and the lack of pronouncing sh and t in the same word. They will not say the word shaitan.
That became like a slander to them that, oh, why won't you say it? And is it because you have a secret? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And no, they're just being respectful.
Curiously, there's a parallel here to like in the beginning of Meetings with Remarkable Men, which is Gurdjieff's second book. So he wrote his secrets in weird novels, as opposed to anything explicitly instructional. But he was turned on to the magic world by the fact that children in his town were trapping a Yazidi child in a circle of chalk, and that the child would not leave the circle of chalk, and they were tormenting him until he was thirsty and hungry, and for what erases the chalk marks so the Yazidi boy can return home. There's definitely an appeal to the fact that Yazidis are a mystery cult that does not take outsiders, and so anybody purporting to have secret knowledge of Yazidi rights and or otherwise well, how did you do this? Because you're not Kurdish. They don't accept converts. It's one of those things of like, it will always be a source of mystery. And like, no, Yazidi is always never going to comment to be like, oh yes, we believe these books are real or not, because like, yes, they're attributed to one of their saints who's believed to be like an avatar of Tawsi Melek, but they don't have to justify themselves to anybody because they don't accept converts. So I think that it, more than anything, really irks the Western mind of like the Protestant itch of like, what do you mean I don't get to know something? How dare you?
Oh, totally.
So like this totally to list Melek Taos in that way. I don't necessarily think by the time we get to like the Anderson Ferry tradition, I think they maybe inherited some of that kind of weight of that name by including it, and probably post Idris Shah and things like that. But at the time of Crowley, it's just more of the like, it's playing on the Egyptian like secrets. I have all the secrets of like, let me name drop Melek Taos in here.
Yes, but I think there's a little bit more. I would give him more credit than that, only because like you brought up the Sufi thing. So Crowley one claims to have been involved with the city Iasawa, right?
Yeah.
As far as like, right. And then
which is curiously, like, let's just examine that. Right? Aisawa, that if I was drunk and said Aiwass instead of Aisawa, no one would think anything of it.
It is pretty interesting because this is happening before the reception of the Book of the Law. So I think that is a possible thing. Later, it's the Master Musicians of Jajuka, where he's out there at the Pan Rite that is like out in Morocco. There's a couple of relationships here, but when you go through confessions, he has specific Sikhs and other individuals who are training him and telling him stories. Now, this is on top of his reading Burton, lots of the solar phallicists who bring this up, like we're talking about like Forlong and a lot of these other dudes. There's a surprising amount of lore in those 19th century texts that I think most of us forget are even there. And now they may not be very accurate, but there's a lot of it. So it wouldn't have been the kind of thing that he just heard pray tell this spooky name and threw it in. He has stories that give a theological reason why he wants to connect it. Similar to when you brought the Sufi stuff, the Tawasin of Mansur al-Hallaj, the same heresy, or it's not really a heresy, but people want it to be and see it that way. Like the same similar, I guess you could say, controversial take on the story of Adam and Iblis, and all of that's in there. And Crowley he's very interested in that. And then there's also books that were popular at his time, Sir Walter Scott's The Talisman, that ascribe to the Saracen leader, Salah ad-Din, a Yazidi parentage, but also claim that he's the son of the devil. And so for a person who really feels so attached to the devil, but believes the devil is something more than just a bad reaction to Christianity, but is deific, he's doing the thing where, kind of like when you see in the Temple of Set or something, right? Where like, it's not just the devil, it's like Set. It's like, you're trying to say like, yeah, I get it. It's a devil. It's more than that. Yeah, Eshumor might have a statue of Baphomet, but it's way more than just that. So you're sort of using these other cultural stories that you're associating it with to sort of magnify the unspeakable ancientness and reality and complexity of this otherwise nameless power.
There's a layer of ascriptions that are both cultural as well as personal for him as to why he would choose to include anything, because that's what any writer is want to do. I just think that there's a lot of speculation on Melektalos Tosi Melek, that is
Totally.
a lot of people wanting to fill their specific agenda and have that kind of, I have the secret that no one else does. And like,
Yeah,
you know,
unfortunately, it's destructive. It hurts
yeah,
those
and-
people.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's the Mishafresh even says specifically the angel that they think Melektalos is connected to, which is not Iblis, and it's Azazel.
Yeah.
So it's like, this is the angel of Sunday. And there's also Mandaean traditions around Azazel and things that we can go into, like that Azazel, Izazel, all the different permutations, not Azael, according to Al. I don't want to make Al mad.
It's when people conflate Azazel and Zazel, the spirit of Mars, with Azazel and that whole angelic, fallen angelic. Like those names shift all the time as the vowels, the consonants, and the people speaking them do. But no, the ruling spirit of Saturn is none of those spirits.
That's right. I remember we talked about it. I was just like, Al will get mad at me for misquoting him too. That'll work too.
I may have a slide or two about it.
Sorry, Doctor. I'm sorry, Doctor. Now I could just think of like all the 90s posters I saw in Bodhi Tree was a good metaphysical store in West Hollywood. Posters of Melektalos and people's artwork interpretation of it. And it's always pick the god of a people you don't know the language of or never met somebody from, and that's going to be your new inspirational god. Is very 90s. Somehow you have a deep connection to them. But that aside, okay, yes, beautiful, fascinating thing to study iconography as it comes out, also through sensationalism, like in the UK, Gurdjieff groups being connected to Yazidi worship as well, but that's because he talks about them in his books. So everybody done claiming Yazidi work.
Bedeviled and bedeviling Orientalisms and their inspirations.
Oh, yeah.
Shadows.
Yeah. Look to the east, and certainly we will find it. The Puerian audacity that is, all your gods are belong to us. But
it's even worse than his. What was it, Fabre de Olivier, or I don't know how to say it, but was the etymologist that Crowley was really into, and he gives these long strings of deities based on like dentals and sibyl, like basically parts of speech, right? That he breaks up like shew, news, like whatever, however they do it. There's like a long list of deities that are associated solely on supposed linguistic connections, and then they get associated with the North or the South, or it's pretty wild. And again, that's like another one of those places where people are blowing off the reality behind it because someone played with etymology one time.
It's the kind of weird framework that allows, in this kind of, I'm not versed enough, so this is a longer conversation, perhaps a return visit. But the knowledge or the fallacy at surface level, let's say, of ceremonial magic as it moves towards its ceremonial magic as a world religion, quote unquote, that necessarily presumes that the historicity of the Judeo-Christian scriptures is actually history. The garden is no longer mythic, but is also historic. That there is, our measurement of time is based off of a false ascription to Jesus' birth, but that ultimately the universe is still a modified version of the Judeo-Christian as the norm from which you can deviate a little or add heresy to allow for more confluence of and incorporation of more associations, correspondences, and otherwise. But that it is an interesting side of it that, I don't know, that still gets to me, right? We're still going to be studying Lurianic Kabbalah as like the foundational unifying ladder of ascriptions, and thinking of this heavily just because I just did this article on correspondences and the history there, and the jab that Crowley supposedly wrote 777 in a week because it was from memory, because he had memorized things in the Golden Dawn and then kind of added just a few things. But this training and things that happens there, our whole history of correspondences is based on astrological magic, but the shift happens, which was combined with medicine and every other science, but the shift towards the kind of occult revival of the 19th and 20th century starts putting everything towards a Kabbalistic framework for everything, which still has planetary possibilities, but shifts it dramatically towards this Christian interpretation of Kabbalah, which then assumes
like Hermetic Kabbalah and stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And
the Filofax cosmology. Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, that's fascinating itself, because that's a whole other topic, right? Correspondences, but I'll deliver my talk first and then have more ideas too. But yeah.
I think luckily, like at least for Thelemites, they're not really stuck in that. If they go through what he's really doing in 777, it's not basing an entire cosmology on the literal take of either the Tree of Life or Lurianic Kabbalah, nor all of those things are convenient as sort of a postmodern structure by which you can catalog your phenomenology. And you almost have to, when you read like his stuff that's not occult, and you're like, look, he's talking about Fichte and Hegel and Berkeley, and like his cosmology, the ontology that he's dealing with is pure. It's just really modern, and he's not trying to shoehorn in his own simple heretical antinomian devilry Christianity. It's these things they're there because they're a part of the Western psyche, and these are the words that we've come to know these forces by. But he's trying to get you to find a way to categorize what's happening to you as well, not just him, but you as well, in an organized way, and using things like the Kabbalah and ciphers and whatnot to organize it, but not to make it a literal place like the Garden of Eden. Here we are,
It's one thing you bring up on the final, my self-imposed chains of stop bringing up every tangent that you think of. But the same thing that Chumley does, right? That in the kind of Azorshuk reference of naming yourself, using your magical name in the very rituals that people are possibly duplicating, but that idea that specifically within Crowley's text of naming yourself as him and acting as if you're him is an interesting side of like that Aiwass becomes your guardian angel through this magical assumption of the magician, of to don yourself in the card of Crowley in order to complete the act, which is an interesting thing because it's not at a certain point. I always wonder, like, do people ever change it and just put their own magical name? I know there's times where you do use your own, but there's other times where it seems like that doesn't happen. And like I always think about that in the cross comparison with Chumley of like people that I know that are really trying to enter into a sabbatic current, whether or not they have anybody connected to Cult of Sabotage or not, but looking at Chumley's works and never changing Chumley's magical name for their own. And that what the confusion is there, I mean, like, this should be something we should examine right away. Like, why are you using his name? And it takes on a different thing now that those discussions can be had posthumously because Chumley is no longer with us. So what is it to take on a dead magician's name is a whole other thing. You talked
about it earlier.
Yeah, exactly.
You brought it up.
Pacts. But like,
that's the inherited pact.
Yeah.
But if that's all you're doing, you're a servant to. It would be the difference if you could call on the name of Moses, so you avoid the car wreck, and maybe that'll work. But if you want to be Moses, you're going to start having to get God to talk to you by your name.
Well, I mean, it's certainly so much of the lists, right, are magical authority. Like, I am Solomon, I am Adam, I am every magician that has ever come there. Well, you're talking into the sorceress genealogy of begats there in some way of like, my understanding of this becomes, I incorporate that and I am everything that he was and more. So it's just interesting. I don't think I have a lot of Thelemite friends and they run the gamut. Like I have people, great talks with you and several other people who are very pro Crowley but aren't worshiping Crowley. And I know quite a few number of people who seem to be worshiping Crowley specifically, or ascribe that they will be like Crowley one day, but that's its own. Everybody's got to have a hobby.
You got to have goals, I guess. Like male pattern baldness and Buddha-like body. There we go.
Making your own death weeks before your gallery exhibition opening.
Absolutely. Okay,
trying to steal William Butler Yeats' girlfriend. Yeah,
Yeats may have deserved it, right? Sorry, Billy. I don't mean that. I love you and every creature slouching towards Bethlehem.
I have a million things I could have gone on about, but
that's why we're friends and more, rather than just worrying about like, hey, come on to this show and like it's great to invite people on and be like, let's see where this goes. Let's go down the rabbit hole. Yeah. This was very much a Josh rabbit hole. It's great.
All right.
On that, I guess we can wrap up. We can wrap up Al specifically. Yes. But I think my visual metaphor was just wrapping Al up in wrapping paper there. I should explain
brown wrapping paper.
Yes.
Christmas tree. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Brown paper packages.
Very Aloysius, every one of us.
Yes. So with that, I guess returning to the feasts of the Holy Martyrs of Ostia in all of their permutations, in all of the hagiographic blur that means what is it to be a martyr of Ostia? What is it to exclaim Ostia amongst a very conservative Spanish crowd? What is it to be the little dick of the little boy? That's not what I wanted to say. Something Puerian. Shit, I'll take this over. I'm done.
Yeah, by the fire in our stones, right? And the texts we can read by them, by the angels and devils and drowned and re-unsubmerged saints at our shoulders, and the voices and the visions, and by the juggling and by the aspiration, and always by the ocean of the dead, always
pulling fire out of water, though, yes, and still being rooted in the earth, even if you have no water inside you. You've passed all your water through you, like a little boy pissing. Truly channeling, right? If we're supposed to approach everything like it's an initiatory act of God speaking to us, what is it to approach every moment of the day as if we're channeling something, or that information is being channeled, to turn the world into angelos, or to turn every stone into topaz, and everything becomes poppy, to dull the pain just enough, and sometimes just to fuck with us. But yeah, shit, what if all magic is just, sleep deprivation is absolutely my drug of choice. Both of you know that.
Yeah,
but
I'm on 4 hours myself.
Yeah, so the milk of the poppy and the tea of the poppy that allows sleep to come for the sleepless. Yeah, some permutation of that long poetic breastplate of Saint Patrick on this day. Thank you, Joshua Adam Sharp of Botanica Macumba and card-carrying OTO member and rabble-rousing upstart. Thank you for spending some time with us tonight.
Yeah, my pleasure. It was absolutely wonderful to hang with y'all. I hope we do it more.
Absolutely. Check out website. What is our official? Go check out radiofreegolgotha.com. There's updates coming. We have some stuff in store this year. There is a speakeasy at the end of this month. I will just put that on here. If you don't know what the speakeasies are, go to radiofreegolgotha.com and find out. And hopefully we'll provide access to former speakeasies on platforms to come. But thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for listening, everyone.
What's the opposite of an Irish goodbye, where we just keep saying goodbye? This is a Puerto Rican goodbye.
I'm told the Midwest has a lot of those as well, from friends from the Midwest.
or an Arab goodbye too, right? Like, how do Arabs say goodbye? Is like they say goodbye by telling you, starting a new story as you're putting on your shoes to leave, and it takes 3 hours. This is the opposite of the Irish goodbye.